So can you please stop sharing for a while? Then we can
Yeah,
have some initial introduction and then we can start.
I'll do that.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this unique workshop on multilateral instruments (MLI). Friends, after a considerable period of time, we are organizing this workshop on very interesting topic of MLI. MLI, though considered to be now quite old in that sense that more than 5, 6, 7 years has elapsed since its implementation. Still, there are quite a few nuances which needs to be learned. In fact, this is the time when people have started applying MLI in practical day-to-day life. MLI is considered to be a treaty on treaty because it is overriding the existing tax treaties. But then, is it automatic, or in which cases it is applied? Whether India has concurred with is opted out of the provisions in some treaties, it is part of MLI. Some MLIs we have not, uh, you know, agreed to the clauses. So there are various nuances which we need to learn, and of course there is a synthesized text which is available, which is incorporating wherever the two countries have agreed to the particular provisions of the MLI. As we all know that it is offshoot of the BEPS program, and BEPS itself is more than a decade-old initiative by the OECD. So in this particular workshop, what we are going to do is to learn about the history, not only the history, but the interpretation of the MLI, how MLI works, how practically it can be applied. We have many now decisions also which would be useful. So faculty would take us through those, and at the end of the course, we have a panel discussion where we are going to discuss some of the case studies integrating the provisions of the MLI. And we have today to kickstart this particular course. We have Mr. Chetan Rao, very learned IRS officer who had been a director on the foreign tax and tax research division and has the privilege of hands-on experience on negotiation of tax treaties as well as from the department side on interpretation and formulation of the uh, government policies. And today is heading the transfer pricing department. So as a commissioner, and I would like to thank him for readily accepting our invitation and for delivering the keynote address. Academically brilliant. We would all learn a lot from him. And before I request Prerna to introduce our faculty, I must thank my both the conveners, Push and Prerna, for this course, who have put in a lot of efforts in putting this course together. And thanks to all the participants. Wish you a happy learning. And may I now request Prerna to introduce our speaker.
Sure. Thank you, sir. So Mr. Chetan Rao is Commissioner of Income Tax and heading the Transfer Pricing Division, and he has in fact drafted a lot of synthesized text. So he has also been previously handling tax treaty negotiations, non-transfer pricing map cases, and he has been a country delegate to the OECD Working Party 1, the task force on the digital economy, and the part of the Indian team negotiating the two-pillar solution to address the tax challenges from the digitalization of the economy. And we are really excited to have you, sir, and learn your views with respect to the MLI and India's experience on MLI. Thank you so much, sir.
A very good evening to all, and it's my privilege to give the keynote address for this workshop. And I extend my gratitude to the organizers for creating a platform in which there can be a learning, and plus we are presently at a very opportune moment, because if you see that we actually complete 10 years of the release of the BEPS action plan reports. So just to start with the disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in my keynote address are mine, and they do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Government of India or its agencies. So to begin with, in next 30 minutes, I will address 6 critical areas, and these are the 6 critical areas that I will be addressing. And so when I was asked for this keynote address, so I was in two minds whether to go just speak without a presentation or with a presentation. So I just remembered that the first time I read the MLI, and I still remember that I could not understand anything. So I thought that it would be better to have something to anchor, and that is why we have a presentation for the keynote address. So firstly, we'll be looking at what was the problem, what led to the BEPS project. And well, this is a collage showing the various news items that had come, and also some which have recently come, but actually have an impact of what was happening before pre-BEPS. So, which is exactly in the first decade of the 21st century. So you see that there were investigations. Even the parliament was calling some CEOs of top companies, and there was a lot of uproar in UK, US, and even in EU. And EU, as a matter, started the state aid proceedings against a number of companies, and one of them has been recently confirmed by the top court of EU, where Apple has to pay around 13 billion of euros back in taxes to Ireland. So if you look at it, a very common theme emerges from it. One, that multinationals are actually planning aggressive tax practices. But another theme that actually comes out of it is you look that there is no news from the Asian, if you look at say India or probably Africa or even from Southeast Asia, but it's mostly European, the EU, or an American news. So what it exactly shows that this was a project which was actually thought about by the G7. And why G7? Because 2008 financial crisis actually really hit them. And after that, we all know that there were bank leaks, and there was the Liechtenstein leak, the HSBC leak, and all of them led to basically G20 and G7 coming in and basically thinking that now is the time to end bank secrecy. And once that the global forum was formed and tax transparency standards were being formed, then the countries actually, then the G20 actually realized that we should also get together and actually solve this issue of base erosion and profit shifting. So that is how this actually project came out to being. And basically, if you look, what is BEPS? BEPS is basically base erosion and profit shifting, and it mainly refers to strategies that multinationals deploy to exploit gaps and mismatches in tax rules, basically to artificially shift profits to location where there are no or low tax or very little economic activity. So as a result of it, obviously there are annual revenue losses, and these annual revenue losses have been estimated to between 4 to 10% of the global corporate income tax revenue. And in 2017, in the OECD background brief, it was estimated that if you look at in numbers, it's around 100 to 240 million dollars. So, but once you go deep into it, the question arises that how do these multinationals are exploiting the rules that were there at present time? If you see, basically there were 4 strategies. You can, of all what was happening, you can actually categorize them into 4 types of strategies. The first strategy was that if you look at a high market country, if you look at a market country which has high tax, so MNEs could really avoid taxable presence, because as we know, the nexus rules are and were still anchored on physical presence, or they could minimize their assets and risks. So what that means, say, set up a trading structure, which means the remuneration as per the transfer pricing rules would be less, or they could maximize their deductions. How would they do it? Say, instead of equity, it will be a heavy debt company, so you will be paying interest. And while doing this, simultaneously, structures were created in intermediate countries where there were low or no withholding taxes, so that basically the market jurisdictions, they don't have to pay much in market jurisdictions, because market jurisdictions generally have high taxes. And so once you look at the intermediate, so they would try to find those intermediate countries which were low tax, even if there was a country which was intermediate, which was high tax, but they actually had those types of intergroup structures which basically achieved low taxation outcomes, say exploiting the preferential regimes, using the hybrid mismatch agreements, and also they shifted all the IPs to those countries where it was taxed low, and they actually maximize their assets and function and risks. So that is how they wanted to show that we have maximum assets, functions, and risk in those countries. And the result was that effectively tax was not paid anywhere it could result, or very low, even in the parent jurisdiction. And why did it happen in parent jurisdiction? Because probably there were no or ineffective CFC rules. They would minimize their assets and risks and maximize their deductions. And it could also happen, say, even if you have CFC rules, so like US had checkbox. So once you checkbox, you have those CFC rules kick in, but the taxation would only come when the funds actually come to US. So it was changed in 2017 after the TCJA came. But those were the type of structures and tax legislations that were there, and they actually enabled many MNEs to form structures that they could exploit and pay low or no tax. And there could be a situation where you actually have double non-taxation. So once you think of it, another question that would come into mind of everybody, that fine, MNA is doing it. It is obviously expected. Even every individual would try to optimize their taxes. Obviously, nobody is really happy paying taxes. But what's the harm? If you carefully look at it, especially from a developing country perspective, even from any country's perspective, what it undermines is the fairness and integrity of tax systems. So if you see that this year, the Nobel Prize has been awarded to 3 economists, and those economists have actually done a study which shows that why institutions matter. If you have strong institutions, your country will be on a growing trajectory. And wherever institutions are weak, it actually reduces your economic growth. So having a fair and a system, tax system in which there's trust is very important for the economic development. Plus, another factor is that if you have this, if there are MNEs who actually pay less taxes, but they then develop a competitive advantage over those local and domestic businesses that actually cannot use BEPS. So which effectively means they can sell their goods at a lower price in those market economies and remove those domestic businesses out of business. So which would actually result not in economic growth, rather than economic decline of a market economy, because it is actually a virtuous cycle. When you pay your taxes, those go into infrastructure, and when infrastructure improves, that improves the overall ecosystem. And whenever the MNEs avoid taxation, actually it undermines, because most of the, if you look at tax systems, they're actually based on voluntary compliance. So that is suffers. And plus, if you look from developing countries' perspective, they mostly heavily rely on corporate income tax rather than personal income tax, and they suffer revenue losses. So in this background, the G20 thought about having a project which where strategies could be developed to address base erosion and profit shifting. And this job was given to OECD. So various meetings were held, and in this project, apart from OECD countries, all the G20 countries also participated, and that is how India was one of the participants of the BEPS negotiations. And the BEPS negotiations basically had three pillars. They were coherence, substance, and transparency and certainty. And these pillars had 13 action points. So, and there were two horizontal action points. So, digital economy, why, when you say horizontal, why horizontal? Because they actually were the base of all these three pillars, and they encompassed those three elements, which they had elements of coherence, they had substance and transparency and certainty. And one was digital economy, which was action one. And the second was the multilateral instrument, which was action 15, which actually the whole course is about. So once we had the BEPS, so we had these 15 action points, then came how do we implement them. So there were two ways of implementing them. They were the action reports were published, and they are in public domain, and anyone would like to read it. They are a very good reading. Uh, Another question that actually comes a lot of times is, what is the status of these action reports? So these action reports are in one way a consensus document, but it does not mean that once these documents have been released, countries are actually supposed to abide by them, make laws according to them. So it is a country's preference, but there are certain action plans, which is 5, 6, 13, and 14, which are in form of minimum standards. And these minimum standards are actually enforced through peer group reviews. So if you see the blue, and if you see the bold 13, 14, and the 5 and 6, so these are the action plans, which are those action plans which are the minimum standards. So now, out of all these minimum standards, all of them could not be translated into the MLI, because, for example, harmful trade practices, so it is not related to treaty law, it is related to domestic law. So once it is related to domestic law, which means in the peer review, when peer review will be carried out, so there'll be certain type of practices like patent boxes, or those types of SEZ regimes. So those will be peer reviewed, but it did not have any impact on the tax treaty. Similarly, if you see the CBCR reporting, which is action 13, so again, it was not something which would be in the treaty, but it was a separate thing, and domestic legislation had to be done in this regard. So basically, the next two slides, which I'll be discussing, gives you a small status update on what India adopted, and how did we actually incorporate them in our domestic legislation. If you see on the action plan, there's red on 2, 6, 7, and 14. So these reds basically indicate that these are the action plans which actually got translated into the multilateral instrument. So the action 2 basically related to hybrid mismatches, action 6 related to prevention of treaty abuse, action 7 related to artificial avoidance of permanent establishment, and article 14 is basically related to mutual agreement procedures. So out of these four, two were the ones which were actually a minimum standard. So they also got translated into the multilateral instrument. I'm not going much into the detail because it's just a keynote address. But what I'm trying to do is only touch topics and just introduce them to you, so that once you have the detailed sessions on all of these action points, so you can actually understand and have a background or a context of what we are doing. So now, to implement these 4 action points, you basically needed an instrument. So one way of doing it was that countries negotiate among themselves. And when countries negotiate among themselves, so obviously the treaty can be modified. But as all of us know, modification of treaties, bilateral negotiations take time. Sometimes, if you look at some treaties, like if you look at US treaty, how long it was negotiated? It was negotiated more than 14 years. So what I'm trying to tell you, there are some treaties probably with between some countries which were negotiated over 20 years. So treaty negotiation, you take time, and plus there are other processes, there's parliament, and above all there are a lot of other considerations, diplomatic considerations, and the geopolitical considerations whenever you get into a treaty. So then it was thought that let's have an instrument which through which we can actually have something in which we sign once, and it's actually you can change all the treaties. So that is how the multilateral instrument was developed, and presently it has been signed by 104 jurisdictions, and it has been ratified by 85 jurisdictions, and it was signed in 2017, and it entered into force on 1st July 2018, and the first provisions entered into force on 1st January 2019. And it's a flexible instrument, so it gives you flexibility. You obviously, once you sign the MLI, and if you are an IF member, you have to adhere to the minimum standards. But regarding the other action plans, which even once those are MLI, so you can give your reservations. You can also notify that I only want it to be applied to a certain treaty, but not to another treaty. So that is how it basically operates. And there's a conference of parties. So whoever signs, that country is part of the conference of parties. And basically, it is responsible for taking any decision or exercising any function, like say, there are a lot of interpretation issues once they are implemented. So you go to basically the conference of parties, and the conference of parties basically they decide how the interpretation would be. So in the previous slide, what you saw, that I said that the multilateral instrument sits on the bilateral convention. So what is the meaning and what is the importance of it? So basically, this slide basically explains to you that there are a lot of multilateral instruments, and but the MLI is different in the fact that it coexists with the bilateral conventions that are currently there. So like I have a treaty, say with US, but I know US is not a MLI signatory. So let's take another country with UK. So I have a treaty with UK. Both India and UK signed the MLI. So whatever notifications, whatever choices they make, those will be automatically be incorporated. How? Because of the very fact of the coexistence. So the multilateral instrument sits on top of the treaty. So which means once you read, you have to read both of them. And that is how that is what the impact is. And that is why once we signed the MLI and once we ratified, so the ratification and the notification was done for only the multilateral instrument, and there was no other notification required, because the rule is that you have to read treaty and the multilateral instrument together. Now the question will come that what is the status of a synthesized text? So that I will discuss in the further slides which are coming. So basically, this is just a snapshot of which shows that how many jurisdictions have signed the MLI, and how many actually agreements are impacted. So presently, the matched agreements are 1965 agreements. So that's the impact that I've have. So when I say waiting agreements, so waiting agreements mean that countries, the agreements that are not matched, since other contracting jurisdiction is not a signatory or a party to MLI, and there could be one way in which, say I have listed a CTA as part of my treaty, but the other country has not listed my CTA. For example, India has basically put all its 93 treaties at which it had at that point of time as part of the MLI notification. But there were some other countries which did not notify those treaties. For example, Switzerland did not, due to some reason. Germany did not. Mauritius did not. So that is why we have those bilateral negotiations to actually have that impact of the multilateral multilateral changes in those treaties, because ultimately, as IF members, all of us are naturally obliged to have the minimum standards. So again, just something what I said, that it's one negotiation, one signature, one ratification. And it's very important is that MLI does not function in the same way as a protocol. It sits alongside existing treaties. And according to the Vienna Convention, it basically applies that since it's later in time, it's not static. So which means today, say I opt for a provision, tomorrow I can opt out of the provision or withdraw my reservations. And it also does not preclude subsequent bilateral modifications of the treaties. And it's very important to remember what I said about synthesized text. They are optional. So every country need not have it. They're just as a facilitator, just to facilitate, just for readability, because obviously if I ask somebody to read the two treaties together, obviously I will not know the impact. So there are many jurisdictions which have actually taken a call, say, I will not publish a synthesized text. So synthesized text is not a legal text. And OECD also developed an online matching tool to facilitate the impact of how actually which provision will actually come and what the matching would be. And on 25th June, India deposited the instrument of ratification to the OECD. And for India, the MLI entered into force from 1st October 2019, and its provision had its effect in India DTAs from financial year 2021 onwards. So next is the next two slides will actually show you how this matching happens. So if you look, say you look at Article 13 of the MLI, so it is basically deal with artificial avoidance of permanent establishment. So it has two options, option A and B. And then it also, in paragraph 4, it also includes the anti-fragmentation. And then comes the compatibility clause. So what that compatibility clause is, that which provisions of the CTA will be impacted. So you can put a reservation on the entire Article 13, or you can reserve that you don't want the anti-fragmentation provision. And then you have to notify the provision of the CTA, which is the notification clause, to make that usually it applies to Article 5.4 of the convention, say with some country, whatever it may be. So now you have X and Y. So these are the positions of X and Y. So country X did not reserve for the entire Article 13, and it did not give a reservation for the fragmentation provision. But that compatibility clause, here it comes, that how would it operate? Say the country Y puts a reservation on fragmentation provision, on the anti-fragmentation provision, which is paragraph 4. So the result of this would be that the MLI provision in respect of activities being strictly auxiliary and preparatory would apply to treaty between X and Y, but the anti-fragmentation will not apply. So basically it's switched off because as Y had made a reservation. So it's a symmetric application. And that is how basically it works. This mechanism works. So now, how does it actually get reflected? So then OECD also developed that for the purpose of readability, we should have something. How do we have that? So that is called a synthesized text. Basically, it's a reflection of the impact of MLI's position. So that is why you have boxes, and it starts with a disclaimer that these are not authentic legal text, but a text of MLI, and the original DTA remains authentic legal text. And basically, they represent a shared understanding between the two countries about the impact of the MLI. And basically, mainly they are to help taxpayers, tax administrations, and other tax stakeholders to understand how the MLI modifies the existing provision. So if you look at India, so we have our income tax site. On site, all these synthesized texts are there. So at present, 32 texts are there. So in the DTA type, you can select synthesized text, and you can see what the synthesized texts are there. And usually this, just an example, so it basically starts that this document has been prepared by the competent authorities of India and Spain and represent their shared understanding of the modifications made by, because they are also exchanged and You will think, why do we have to exchange? Because at many times there are asymmetric applications also, depending on the provisions of the multilateral instrument. And once you see that it can actually lead to quite interesting results. So that is why it is always better to share and exchange them. And it starts with the disclaimer box. So actually it writes that the authentic legal text of convention and MLI take precedence and remain the legal text applicable. This is a very important disclaimer and a very important one also. So there can be different types of applications. So like there could be asymmetric. For example, in India, Egypt DTA, currently India has adopted, obviously India opted for the option C, which is the credit method, but Egypt has still the exemption method. So it will apply asymmetrically. So for India, it will be credit, and for Egypt, it will be the exemption method. Even similarly, in the prevention of treaty abuse, India has opted for slob, but Greece has not adopted for slob. But the way it had made a reservation also, so slob will be applied asymmetrically by India. Similarly, there could be notification mismatches. So say if you look at carefully at India's and UK synthesized text, so both of the synthesized texts published by one by UK and one by India are different. Why? Because we have only notified that the earlier limitation of benefits, which was 28C, would be replaced with PPT. But UK has, apart from the Article 28C, it has also notified SARs, which are which are specific anti-avoidance rules, which are in Article 11, 12, 13, and 13. So in their synthesized text, they are replaced. So they are not there. They're striked off in one way, but in our they're still there. So that is why both of the noted respective positions is in form of the footnote. And why is that so? The question arises. It is because of the it's because of how they saw the impact of having SARs in their treaties and how we saw that what would be the impact on the PPT. So there could be also differences in formatting and drafting of the synthesized text, because if you look in Netherlands, the one synthesized text they have published, they don't incorporate the disclaimer boxes, and in which you have the journal comments and entry into 4 states. And in like India has used square brackets and italics format, where there were minor terminology changes in the original text of MLIs. Some countries have not adopted. In case of Ireland, what we have done, we have put a box and said it replaces this. So, but Ireland has adopted the format of strike through, and similarly, some countries have not used the references like modified or replaced by. So where did they come from? Basically, they came from the model synthesized text, which was published by OECD. So there are other peculiarities, like France has adopted a different approach, and so like Latvia prefers an exchange of informal letters. Similarly, Sweden considers that since synthesized texts have no legal value, so why publish them? And similarly, some other countries have some different views. So just a small snapshot of what the practices of countries are with respect to synthesized text. And but it may be mentioned that probably the other country may not have published its synthesized text, but India has obviously published its synthesized text. And when we did so, we exchanged the text with the other country, and they obviously then conveyed that what their position was on synthesized text. So while I come to the last part of the keynote, and it's about time. So just to tell you that obviously the BEPS project has a lot of successes, because it brought in the CBCR reporting, and it brought a lot of changes even in transfer pricing, because it brought on the significant people function, brought the DEMPE function, introduced DEMPE, made it more formulary, and tried to address the gaps that were there in the arm's length principle. And if you look at it, another thing was that it basically was a first global cooperation. So when we talk about multilateralism, so Global Forum and this BEPS project actually brought countries together, and it sets up, it sets standards. So when I say it sets standards, so like if you look at it, that you have today the you're talking about the multilateral instrument of for the subject to tax rule. So it was the pioneer. Similarly, UN is also thinking of a fast track instrument. So all of these instruments are basically inspired by the MLI. And it also inspired, now in Amount A, we are thinking of a multilateral treaty. We are looking at a multilateral convention. So at a lot of times, a lot of people ask the question that what is the difference between a multilateral convention and a multilateral instrument? Well, how you look at it is that a multilateral convention is actually a treaty that overrides, while a multilateral instrument is something that sits with the treaties. So that is what the difference is. Though probably one could say that why not name it a convention? But that is how the international terminologies have evolved, and uh, and and that is how the differences are. Though at a lot of times there's a lot of blurring of boundaries, but that is how the things are. But having success said that yes, BEPS project was a success, but there are a number of shortcomings. So if you saw the first slide, you would have seen that a lot of companies, in when we are talking about problems, were those companies which were digital companies. And action one was on the digital economy, but it did not offer any definitive solution. And why? Probably you would have thought, let's change the nexus, but then there's a problem of profit attribution. So ultimately, what we had was that now the so-called two-pillar solution is also called BEPS 2, because this was one of the failures of BEPS. Second part of it was that though we tackled the problem of non-taxation, but another problem was that still BEPS could not actually stop the profit shifting. So that is why pre-BEPS we had a focus on avoidance of double taxation. The BEPS basically focus so that we avoid situations of double non-taxation. And now the BEPS 2 project, in which we have the pillar 2, the globe rules, basically focuses on minimum taxation. So that is how the shifts are there. So BEPS is one of the important milestone and an intermediate milestone on how the things actually developed. And that is why it is very important to look that what are the learnings. And if you saw, even the problems that were highlighted were those of the OECD countries, EU countries, the developed countries, the G7 countries. So developing countries, there are very few developing countries on the table in the even in the negotiations. And the very fact, the main problem of developing countries is domestic resource mobilization, but that was not part of the agenda. And if you look at even at the PE, that which is Action 7, uh, and there is a very low uptake. Even among EU countries, there's very low uptake. Very few countries have opted for it. And they only basically mainly opted for the minimum standards. And plus, another problem was the limited participation of countries in this. So that is from me. And I hope you have a very productive learning and take the maximum use of this learning workshop. And thank you very much from my side.
Thank you, Mr. Chetan Rao. It was a very apt and very illuminating keynote address, I would say, where you took us through the history of the maps, the development of MLI, the importance of MLI as one treaty sitting on the existing treaties, how to uh, go for and reading of it. Of course, interpretation we'll see later, but at least synthesized text. What is the importance of synthesized text, and what are the global developments? Uh, of course, the the heart of MLI, what we have learned is a PPT, uh, even the preamble and limit, slop, that is limitation of benefits provisions. specific anti-avoidance provisions in the tax treaties and MLIs. And you also very candidly, you explained the shortcomings of the BEPS projects itself, and where do we stay vis-a-vis the digital taxation, pillar 1, pillar 2 solutions, a long way to go, and the globe where countries have agreed for the minimum taxation. So all in all, it was a very enlightening session. Thank you very much, sir, for setting the tone for the entire workshop. And I hope that all our participants will benefit immensely. May I now request Kush to propose a very well deserved vote of thanks. And then immediately we will continue with the second session with Maikel.
So just before we leave, are we opening up the session for questions from the audience? Because a couple of them have raised their hands. So we
Kush, I think we are running short of time. If any specific 1 or 2 questions you can take.
I think I'll request the participants to then send in their questions by way of the question and answer box, and we can then possibly get Chetan sir's views on them and share them with the participants later, so that we can
I saw
maintain.
2 questions, Kush. I saw 2 questions, so I've already replied to them.
Sure, sir. So in case there are any more questions, I think that can come through the box. We can. Okay. So, sir, thank you so much for a wonderful session. As Mayur said, you set the tone for the workshop, and I think everyone here was extremely happy to hear from you with your experience and background. So I could not think of a better person to kick off this workshop. So on behalf of the participants and IFA India WRC, thank you so much for sharing your time and being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, friends. We'll immediately begin with our second session, and we have with us Mr. Maikel Evers. Thank you, Maikel. Thank you for joining early. Sorry we noticed you a little later. Thank you very much, and we are indeed, honored to have you on the this particular workshop. Maikel is a president of the IFA Netherlands, and he has been the architect, I would say, and participated actively in MLI. So, and he was a part of the OECD team. But with this brief comments from my side, I would request Prerna to introduce him formally. He's going to take us through the overview of the MLI, and now actually we are, diving into the learning the entire course on multilateral instruments. So we are really happy there to have you on board, and for this very interesting and opening batsman, Maikel, welcome. Prerna, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, sir. So Maikel is a partner at EY, and he has been leading EY's EU tax policy hub. And before joining EY, he held several positions in the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration. Specifically, he has been advisor to for the multilateral instrument. He has been in charge of the work on the MLI Action 15, and he has been also a coordinator of the BEPS project as a special advisor to the director and deputy director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration. He has been advisor to the Tax Treaty TP and Financial Transaction Division and the Tax and Development Program. He has also been a policy advisor to the Ministry of Finance of the Netherlands. So thank you so much, Maikel, for sparing your time, and over to you. We look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, and hello everybody. So very happy to talk to my IFA friends in India. Indeed, I am the president of the Dutch branch, and also I've been active in the global IFA organization, and have had the opportunity to also in that capacity visit IFA events in India a couple of times. So this time, unfortunately, only virtually. As a matter of fact, I'm speaking to you from all the way from Buenos Aires, where I'm on vacation. But I was happy to take a short break from my vacation to talk about the MLI with you. And we've already had an excellent introduction by the Indian delegate with also the perspective from India, but also the broader perspective on the MLI, its background and its function. And I basically wanted to build on that, which then also eventually becomes an introduction to the other sessions, right? Because you will be diving into very specific aspects of the MLI in more detail with different speakers. So I think that that's an excellent idea, and also look at a couple of more fundamental questions more deeply, like the relationship between the MLI and international law as such, and what that means, for example, for treaty interpretation. So the idea that I had for this session was to basically plant some of some ideas already into your mind, so that you can chew on that while you go through the more detailed discussion with the next speakers. So what I had in mind in terms of the key things to discuss is to look a bit further into the background of the MLI. We already heard a lot about the BEPS project, the political background to it, the participation of the relevant countries, the role of the G20, but maybe we could take it a little bit further down into history. Because if we have a good look also at the history of tax treaties, we eventually might develop a clearer view on the future. So at the end of this session, I will also want to talk about some of those emerging instruments that was already touched upon, for example, the UN instruments, and those are basically the buns of the sandwich. And then in the middle, we will look into the key features of the MLI in a little bit more detail, to add a little bit of color, also with my background as a coordinator of the MLI project, to give a bit of a behind the scenes insight into what happened basically from the time that the MLI text was adopted, so it was late 2016, to the actual signature, ratification, and entry into force. And that was at the time where I was indeed at the OECD Secretariat. I was there from around 2015 to 2020. So I promised to start with the brief dive into history. And the reason for that is that I wanted to ask you to think about who are actually the inventors of tax treaties as we know them. And maybe some of you then immediately think about the League of Nations some 100 years ago, right? If you still open a lot of international tax law textbooks, the first chapter will probably be about the work of the League of Nations. And the conceptual work that has been done by the four economists, by the initial thinking around that time around things like PEs already. And also a little bit later, there was, I think, a little bit more in the 1930s about what eventually became transfer pricing in a separate entity approach. But those are not the inventors of tax treaties as we know them, the people who were delegates to the League of Nations at the time. The history starts quite a bit earlier, more than 150 years ago. So these two men were kings in what is now Germany. But at the time, Germany was not a united country. So you had a patchwork of individual kingdoms, principalities, even some small republics. And these two men were the kings of the Kingdom of Prussia and the King of Saxony. But at the same time, although these were separate states, they were increasingly integrating, and soon after they actually became part of the German Empire. But they were still holding on to their sovereignty with respect to monetary policies or their own currency, taxes as well. At the same time, they saw that their economies were integrating. So they all spoke the same languages. Yeah, there was a lot of cross-border activities. So also cross-border activities of, especially in time of industrialization, where you not only had exports across the border, but also, of course, producers setting up shop, maybe a local establishment in another country. So that whole concept of what we now know of permanent establishment comes from that era, the time of industrialization, the times of initial economic integration, but where countries were simply not yet willing to harmonize their taxes. And fast forward to the history right now, that is still quite hard. In the EU, we're still struggling with that. We're now at 27 member states that are deeply integrated in terms of economy and trade, but still holding on to their tax sovereignty. But then you need something to match up those different systems. And that is why the delegates for these two kings came up with a system that sort of recognized the tax systems as they were. And those were typically also not comprehensive income tax systems yet, but they were scheduler tax systems. So specific types of taxes for specific types of income or activities. So that is also why to date, tax treaties still have that structure where it sort of identifies a specific economic activity or a specific income category. And once that has been identified, then there's agreement about which states may tax with priority. And that's the structure that we still have there, but it's a structure that is built on that tax that is more than 150 years old, designed on the economy of more than 150 years ago. But since then, a lot of things changed, of course. That went a bit too fast. So we had profits that used to be aligned with the actual location of the activities, and also therefore profit taxation that used to be aligned. But that over time, at least that was the acquisition in those media reports that we already saw, is that there has that there was a disconnect at some point between where the actual profits are generated, where the economic activities takes place on one hand, and on the other hand, where profits were reported for tax purposes. And that is where indeed the G7 countries and soon after that, the broader group of G20 countries started looking into this already in the course of 2020, indeed in response to some of these media reports, and started working on a project which became a project to address this issue of the base being eroded and profit being shifted away. That became the BEPS project. And that for the outside world, that project indeed started in 2013 with at first a diagnosis that we saw with that very basic structure of sort of the tax planning 101 of the time, and that then later became the action plan with the 15 action plans, 15 action points that all produced also specific outputs, some just recommendations. 4 of the actions produced also minimum standards, as we saw, and then we later came into that process of, let's call it BEPS 1.0 being implemented. So we're still in that. We're still in that implementation phase. But also, as we also saw, we saw a new phase that is often referred to as BEPS 2.0 or the 2 pillars. That is a project with a separate mandate that builds on the prior work. And if you read the G20 summit communique of earlier this week, there might even be some suggestions for additional work to come. But that's what we're not focusing on. So we're basically still dealing with that work, that mandate that is more than 10 years old. So how did we end up also with those initial 15 actions? Here I would like to say that in these discussions about the scope of the project, the nature of the project, although it was perhaps driven by some of the European nations, countries like India had been involved through the G20 process quite early in the beginning. And what eventually became the first action item, BEPS Action 1, on the digitalization of the economy, that was also very much pushed for by emerging economies, so including India. At the same time, behind the scenes, also there were capital exporting countries at the time were very much against the project. In particular, also the US, that changed over time depending on who was in power in the US. But also a country like Germany was initially a little bit concerned about that specific action item. Another action item that was added also relatively late in the setup of the project concerns the MLI, because there was a realization that maybe finally tax treaties would need to be strengthened, that work on tax treaties would build on work that was already undertaken in a way by the tax treaty experts in the OECD, so that Working Party 1, and we just saw one of the delegates talk about that as well. The work on anti-treaty abuse was building on intellectual work that had already been undertaken, but it was now the realization, if there will be that political push through what became the BEPS action plan, we need to make sure that those treaty changes can be implemented fast, and that is what we're looking at. So we're looking at that question that was initially put already in that action 15 from the very beginning. So the question how to modify the 3,000 plus tax treaties that are there. And we talked about the options already. Bilateral negotiations take a long time. Maybe we could speed it up a little bit with model protocols to amend treaties. That would just speed up not only sort of the technical work, right? So the legal drafting, which costs time, right? It's a lot of work. Often you do it in English, and maybe not the legal, not maybe the first language or the mother tongue of the negotiators. It could also help to contain the topics, to try and make sure that the negotiating parties would limit their discussions to the specific aspects that need to be updated as an outcome of the BEPS project, rather than them also adding, hey, maybe we also have something on personal income tax that we should add. So that would have been an advantage of trying to keep that small and just design model protocols. But you would still end up at the bilateral negotiation table, and there's still that risk that it's difficult to contain those topics to keep it limited in terms of scope. So that's why they explored something else, the design of indeed a multilateral convention. And that became one to sit on top of and modify bilateral tax agreements. And we already touched upon that, but we might need to dissect that a little bit. And that also helps maybe for your later discussion on the interpretation of the MLI, so that we all really have the same understanding of what the MLI does and what it doesn't do. Now, in any case, what was needed when it was decided to come up with some kind of a multilateral instrument, also to have multilateral negotiations. So how does that actually work? So basically, you lock up a lot of smart people in a big room in Paris. That's where the OECD is hosted. So it looks basically like this. So you have delegations, so country representatives there around the table. And in the case of the MLI, it was also important to ensure that in principle, every state that in the end would be interested in joining this international law instrument would also be able to participate in the negotiations. For that purpose, the OECD established also a separate group. So it was in a way attached to the BEPS work, but also a bit separate. There were already maybe some countries there that did not even want to commit yet to the BEPS project at the time, but were interested in being a part of the multilateral negotiation. So that's what happened there. They were sitting there in the room, but what were they discussing at the time? When they were really negotiating the actual text of the MLI, so 2015 also up until the end of 2016, they could leverage on the substantive revisions that were already developed. So they first focused on those BEPS action items that were treaty related, including 6, 7, and 14, and then to be able to lift those articles and then turn that into, because they were drafted as model convention provisions, to lift that into a new form of multilateral convention. So they could basically focus on the more mechanical questions. So how to do that, how to modify tax treaties to implement the agreed measures. Now, tax treaties that are typically concluded on a bilateral basis, there are exemptions, but mostly bilateral basis, they are modified quite often, right? So then that is where I'm sure you're familiar with them, you have those amending protocols. So as I already mentioned, the countries meet again, they sit together, and often those amending protocols also really take the form of almost textual amendments, right? Where you say paragraph 1 of that article is now being replaced by the following text, right? It's really sort of a cut and paste or delete and paste maybe of provisions. So that is not a choice that was made here. So they did not design a text that would say exactly that. For example, it did not say, hey, here we have a new version of Article 5, paragraph 4. Delete your existing Article 5.4 in your bilateral treaty, and now the following is applicable. So they did something else. And we'll see what that is in a bit more detail in a second. But they also did one more thing, and that costed quite a lot of time. So because there, some of the substantive provisions really needed to be developed from scratch. And that is the chapter on mandatory arbitration in the context of the mutual agreement procedure. All of that ended up in the multilateral convention. The text was formally adopted in the fall, or the European fall of 2016, in the English and the French language. So those are the authentic texts. And with the adoption of the text, that is sort of basically set in stone, right? So then after that, you cannot touch the text anymore as negotiators. Why that's important, we will also come back to that briefly when we discuss some of the pending instruments, the new instruments that might be coming your way. So we had the text at that time, but there was also a bit of a problem because that text became quite complicated because it had to facilitate different policy preferences. So elements of flexibility that we already touched upon in the previous session. So what was in any case decided is that states who sign up to the MLI should be able to specify and basically also agree on which bilateral, multilateral treaties should be covered. So it's not that when India signs up, when the Netherlands signs up, when Argentina signs up, automatically all their conventions are updated. So it needed to be a specific choice. We were also dealing with minimum standards where some flexibility had been agreed within the Committee on Fiscal Affairs of the OECD. So yes, all of them would need to adhere to the minimum standards. Those four that we heard about, you need to do it in a specific way because you will be subject as a country to peer review, as we heard. But how you reach it, there are different alternatives. So, for example, that relates to the principal purposes test or the limitation on benefits test, where you can choose between. We also are dealing with treaty provisions, as we've already seen, and we will see again, that are not minimum standards, so that countries also even have more flexibility to choose whether and how to implement them. Yeah, and then on top of that, there were additional or alternative provisions. So one of the sort of additional provisions is that entire rule set of the arbitration provisions that I just touched upon. So that's even an entire additional chapter. So quite a lengthy process that was necessary. So we had those multilateral negotiations with more than 100 jurisdictions on an equal footing. So formally there were states there, but there are also a couple of states that consist of different jurisdictions. So for example, the Kingdom of the Netherlands consists of a couple of separate countries that were also able to get a seat at the table, although at the end of the day, it's the Kingdom of the Netherlands in that example signing as one state. But what was also important is that there were participants from all continents and all level of development. Now, again, they did not have to do that much of negotiations anymore on the substantive provisions, but also there, all the diversity at the table also made sure that full flexibility that should be there from the context of the other BEP sections was also accordingly introduced in the setup of the instrument itself. Now, when the text was done, my predecessor in the OECD Secretariat, who had led, I would say, 90% of the drafting process, decided to leave the OECD Secretariat. So on one hand, the text was done, a lot of work with all the smart delegates, but the work had only just started. Because of all that flexibility that we just talked about, we needed quite a big process to get countries also ready to sign, those countries that were interested to sign. That it was not only a matter of those countries going through the necessary domestic processes, right? So if the Indian government wants to sign any convention, there are internal checks and balances and processes to go through before an adopted text that we talked about can actually be taken up and can be signed by the authorized representative of the Indian government. But here we were dealing with an instrument that had all that flexibility. So we had to make sure that there was a matching of the agreement, et cetera, et cetera. So for this purpose, the MLI positions were sort of put together. Those are the positions that are now also formally delivered to the depositary of the MLI. So once a country signs and then also later goes through the approval processes, through the ratification processes, the position of a country would need to be clarified. So the preferences of India with respect to which treaties to be covered, which options to be chosen, with reservations to be made and notifications to be made. So that would need to be prepared by each of the countries that wanted to sign. And there were only like 6 months or so available for that. That was already quite a tough exercise, and it's a lot of homework for the individual countries, but it's also something that needs to happen bilaterally. And we already heard about notification mismatches, but ideally, as much as possible, there is alignment between the different parties, right? So this is where the speed matching sessions were held in February 2017. Is one of the things I helped organizing as soon as I got into this project as well. So what we did is we invited all interested delegations to come to Paris. We set up schedules. So we asked which countries were interested in talking with each other. We had sort of speed match. It was almost like a speed matching dinner, but there was no food, only coffee, I think, to keep the brains working. And this is where countries could very quickly meet, compare their homework, and says, I think we want to notify each other. Do we have a match also in the position? Do we have a match also in the notifications? If no, we need to do a little bit of additional work. And that brought a lot of countries in the position to actually sign right before the European summer break in 2017. Already there having those MLI positions. But it was also a bit of a problem, not only for the countries who were working on those MLI positions, but we were also thinking ahead about the end users, so all the legal experts. Because the way that this instrument now works, it sits, as we now understand, on top of the bilateral treaties. But it's not that only that instrument. You need to put on top of that basically those two MLI positions that we talked about. So you need to work out how all of that matches up. And for that, in my team, we developed also the first version of the MLI matching database. That is where we try to put all the data from those draft MLI positions together and come up with some algorithms and formulas that did sort of the basic matching between the different positions automatically. Look into that. And I think that already helped a bit to get to a bit more transparency. And eventually, we also came up with that context of the synthesized text that at the side of the OECD Secretariat we worked on to so basically give guidance to countries who were interested in producing these type of texts, how to do that consistently. And we've already seen the countries eventually also took, of course, some different approaches there because they also needed to fit it into some kind of a format that was workable and recognizable in their context, in their national context, in the way their government or their competent authority typically releases documents. But the guidance was there, and this is, I think, a piece of homework that a lot of countries then took up, mostly after 2017, I would say. Now, I wanted to look a bit closer to some of those mechanisms that we already looked at, because also when I joined this project, there was a lot of work that needed to be done also to just help explain also the outside world in how these mechanisms work. So that's how I indeed at the time drafted also these slides. And I thought, well, maybe you can look at it almost as sort of indeed an app where you can make different choices. And first of all, it was important to sort of recognize, if you were a first-time reader of the MLI, to recognize the structure. So upfront, typically, and this is the example of Article 13, you will find upfront the substantive provisions. So the provisions that are actually meant to apply with respect to those covered tax agreements. And in the case of Article 13, and you don't worry, you will look into that article in more detail, I think next week. In that case, you will have even two options as a country that signed up, an option A and option B. So it's almost like selecting an option, A or B, or none. And in this case, it was even an Article 5.4.1. So you have in total 3 paragraphs, so paragraphs 2, 3, and 4 of Article 13 that contain the substantive provisions. And then always follows what is called the compatibility clause. And that links to what I said earlier, that it's not a text replacement, but it describes how the substantive provisions of Article 13, paragraph 2, 3, 4 apply with respect to the covered text agreement. So that's what this thing does. And then the switches, almost like light switches, come next, in this case, in paragraph 6 of the article. So a country that signs up basically has the right simply not to like some of these provisions. That is called a reservation. So that's a concept that is not new. You find it in a lot of international law instruments anyway. And a reservation can be made by a single party signing up. And once a reservation is made, it applies for that country in relation to all its bilateral relationships under this convention. So here, for example, a country can reserve on the entire Article 13, so none of Article 13 would apply if this reservation is made. Or you can also do it for specific options, specific elements. So maybe only for option A, maybe only for that fragmentation clause. So I think that's important to remember. So if India would pull the switch, the first one, the reservation on entire Article 13. Article 13 would never apply between India and any of the other MLI signatories. For the other signatories, it would of course still apply unless that country would then pull the switch as well. Now, suppose we are dealing with a country that only reserves on the fragmentation provision, so that one will not apply for country A with respect to its covered tax agreement. So that's then also in a way binding the other parties. Now, there needs to be a little bit more clarity because that's what we already saw. We wanted to have a bit more clarity about which existing provisions are then affected, are then modified. So the compatibility clause does it already a little bit, but you also need to at least make known in that MLI position that I talked about that country A has a preference for option A. And also then indeed, as we saw, that there is an existing provision in the country AX bilateral treaty, which would be modified as a result of this provision. So in that case, they've identified Article 5, paragraph 4 of the AX treaty. So this is how the structure of that article then works, and also how you will find notifications in the MLI position of country A, and probably also in the MLI position of country X, and then you would need to do that matching that we just talked about. Just a brief word, and I'll accelerate a little bit because we talked about that already. So Action 6 minimum standard. So members of the inclusive framework have committed to the Action 6 minimum standard, and they can reach it in different ways. So they basically need to update their treaty network over time. That can be done bilaterally. That can be done also through the MLI. And then for the MLI, I think most countries have just simply been looking to apply the principal purposes test. There are also other provisions, there are optional provisions. This is where that SLOP, or maybe it's better to call it simplified LOB, comes into place as an alternative revision. So I think that most countries here have chosen, if not all by now, chosen the PPT in any case as the default rule. In theory, you could also decide to reserve on the principal purposes test, but I think none of the MLI signatories have done so. So that would be quite unique, but it's legally possible. There are some more quirky things that we already saw a little bit in the previous session. There are all kinds of asymmetrical application possible as well. So if you are a country like India that wants to introduce the simplified LOB on top of the article, on top of your existing covered tax agreement with the PPT there as well, then you will need to look at what other countries have done. So if you look at the initial positions, you saw some interesting variations popping up. So the initial matching that we looked at between India and Russia, there was a match, two countries that wanted to simplified LOB, so there it would apply. South Africa did not opt in because it's an optional provision. Optional provisions require, in principle, both countries to sign up. South Africa didn't want to match that, so that was the end of it in that treaty relationship. For Denmark, you would come to the same conclusion if you would look at the MLI positions, but there is a specific provision that allows the simplified LOB to apply symmetrically. So this is a provision where Denmark would sort of accept if another country wants a simplified LOB, even though it's not its own preference. And there's also that other variation that we already saw with Greece, where Greece says we don't like the LOB, but we also don't mind the other treaty partners, so the other side of the contracting parties, to apply the simplified LOB provision. So that is where the provision apply asymmetrically. So there are many of these sort of quirky things, and all this goes back to what I told earlier about the need to have that flexibility built in. I wanted to talk about the entry into effect. So I wanted to maybe have a quick look with you at some of the emerging issues with respect to new multilateral instruments and how they also relate to what we already discussed in the previous session and with respect to what I just mentioned. So maybe just to recap a couple of the notions that were very important. So we're still dealing with a tax treaty network that is mostly bilateral, a treaty network that goes back more than 150 years. Yes, there has been also a lot of work done by international organizations over time. Yes, the League of Nations was important for international standard setting. Yes, the OECD has been important for standard setting, with first the OECD Model Tax Convention development, to which also India started participating well before the BEPS project started. And then more recently, as we saw, we have the BEPS project in different phases, BEPS 1.0, BEPS 2.0, maybe something also, a new project related to progressive taxation. We will see where that will end up. Now, what we have in force in terms of a legal framework now is still that network of those mostly bilateral treaties, and we have that MLI sitting on top of that, dealing with or bringing into place a lot of provisions that you would need to read in that separate instrument. The legal, the exact legal status of the MLI, that's one important thing to remember as well, also varies a little bit from countries to countries. And that is something that is, I would say, mostly always ignored almost always ignored in the international negotiations, because it's difficult enough and they're very country specific. But generally, there are two types of countries in terms of how countries deal with international law obligations in relation to their own domestic system. So we have so-called monist countries, and an example of a monist country is a country like the Netherlands or Belgium, where international law and local law are part of the same body of law. It's just that international law, like the MLI or tax treaties, are highest in hierarchy. So that is where you, as a taxpayer, can basically apply a tax treaty directly. So there's no need for a translation of the international obligation between countries for it to also apply directly to taxpayers or individuals. So if I go to court in the Netherlands as a taxpayer and I want a treaty to be applied, I can directly invoke the benefits of the tax treaties. So it doesn't work the same in other countries, like in Germany and also countries with mixed countries, related into domestic law for a citizen or taxpayer to be affected. So in those countries with that so-called dualist system, it also very much depends on how that local translation has been done, and if there's sort of translation mistakes in there can be all kinds of issues that arise. But that's maybe something for also the next session that I know we'll also talk about, and the status of these multilateral agreements. But why am I saying this? This is also a little bit of a segue into this final subset, which is about the other instruments that we have now. So quite recently, just the other month in September, the OECD held a signing ceremony for the subject to tax rule multilateral convention. So the subject to tax rule, the STTR, was developed in the context of the Pillar 2 work. So of course, most of the attention went to the globe rules and minimum tax rules that really are there coming into place through domestic law. But also work was done to introduce a treaty-based provision. And that has a bit of a funny history, as a matter of fact. So if you do go back to the history of the whole discussion on Pillar 2 and minimum taxation, and I was still at the OECD Secretariat when it started. So the request for Pillar 2 was put on the table, again, mostly by G7 countries, and it was in particular Germany pushing for that. And Germany initially pushed for something like introducing a subject to tax rule, both in tax treaties and in domestic laws. And domestic law that would, for example, take the form of a denial of a deduction if there was not a relevant take-up of the payment, so a low tax rate, for example, in the hands or in the state where the beneficial owner was located. Now, of course, if you are familiar with the global minimum tax rules, the GLOBE rules, we know that that whole framework has taken quite a different direction, right? We have that whole system where we have the global tax base, ETR calculation, etc. But this STTR thing is still an element that does really come from the genesis of that BEPS project, and it's now still out there. It is a provision that was already released before, a provision that was released as a model OECD Model Tax Convention provision. So also there, they had the same question again. So we have a new Model Tax Convention provision. There are also commitments of countries to implement this provision. How are we going to do that? So one thing they could have done quite easily is to just update the MLI and add some new elements to the MLI. Because the legal framework is there, the MLI itself allows for that. There is a conference of the parties that could also help deal with that. So the whole legal infrastructure was there, yet they did not choose to do that. So I think that's also maybe an important sign, right? That maybe that instrument in a way was too complex or whatever. So they designed a separate instrument. And what is also striking that is that for now, only 9 jurisdictions have signed the MLI for the STTR, the separate instrument. You see them here, that more countries will sign. In any case, the countries there on the right side of the slide have indicated that they're interested in signing up to this thing. I also suspect that maybe many other countries might do it in a bilateral way, because what the OECD has also explained is that work is being done to identify which treaties need to be updated in any case, and to come up with some kind of toolkits for the treaty partners to just deal with the introduction of the STTR potentially on the basis of a bilateral protocol. So that's an option for them as well. Now, what is not really out there in the public domain, but I think a very important one as well that is being considered, is a global tax certainty instrument. As the GLOBE rules are being rolled out, so at least we have the 27 EU member states, there are a couple of other European countries, countries in Asia Pac also increasingly looking at the GLOBE minimum tax rules. So there is a slow rollout of the GLOBE rules ongoing. As a matter of fact, the rules are live, they're out there. Let's see what will actually happen to the global minimum tax also under the Trump administration. But leaving that aside, so if we just assume that GLOBE will just continue to be implemented at least by a sizable group of countries, they will start applying it. There will also be new disputes arising under in the application and interpretation of the GLOBE rules. Now, how to deal with those? Because those might be indeed international disagreements, disagreements between different countries that apply the GLOBE rules in parallel, and there's a conflict, there's a double taxation, that's the result. So what can you do as a taxpayer then? Can you as a taxpayer going forward then rely on the existing mutual agreement procedure in tax treaties, or perhaps even the MLI arbitration chapter that I referred to? Is that suitable for these GLOBE disputes that will arise? Well, the MEP procedure in principle applies or has been designed to address conflicts in the interpretation or application of tax treaties themselves, rather than these GLOBE issues, which would be mostly the domestic law issues. I think the OECD members and also the Secretariat are still looking at to what extent maybe the MEP procedure can be useful, or maybe can be adapted a bit. But there are also countries in the inclusive framework pushing for maybe something like a new instrument there as well, so a global tax certainty instrument. There are different ways of how that could be designed, but one of this could be another multilateral convention, but then perhaps more targeted at the issue of preventing, maybe, and in any case, resolving disputes. But another interesting thing that this convention may do, at least that is an issue that some countries will be asking for, is a clarification of the relationship between tax treaties and the GLOBE rules. Because if you look at academic literature still, if you look at the position of some countries, there are concerns that the GLOBE rules result in a treaty override. And one way to solve that treaty override is to also confirm in an international law instrument that the GLOBE rules are compatible with tax treaty obligations. So that's maybe another thing that they could address here. So if something like this comes, and the discussions are ongoing, will at least take well into 2025, we might see another multilateral instrument convention appear at the horizon. So we're potentially adding more and more multilateral conventions to the pile. Now, we already heard the previous speaker talk about the UN fast track instrument that is also being discussed. There's a UN Model Tax Convention, as you are probably all aware of. That UN Model Tax Convention is different from the OECD Model Tax Convention in terms of who are the authors. And then I'm not talking about developing versus developed countries, but I'm talking about the fact that the UN Model Tax Convention is developed by experts. So experts that do have a link with government, but formally are sort of independent experts on international tax matters. So that means that the model is, the UN model has not been produced in an intergovernmental process. And that's different with the OECD model. Nevertheless, of course, it is an important guide for developing countries in particular in their negotiations with developed countries. So it's important at the negotiation table for bilateral treaties. The model is updated regularly by those experts, and also there the question often arises, so how can we introduce those updated provisions, model provisions into the treaties? So you come to the same question again, how can we also update treaties more quickly? And the experts themselves looked into this question again, and they called for the help, or they found help from Philip Baker and a couple of others, so academics who looked into this question before. As a matter of fact, they were initially also consulted in the OECD process on Action 15. So in the very first BEPS year, so it was 2013 to 2014, those academics were also consulted. Their recommendations were not taken on board, and the MLI took a different trajectory, as we saw. We know what the outcome is, but they gave it another shot, and they have now helped the expert committee develop a fast track instrument that is now finished. The text is there somewhere on the UN website, but it's also going to be taken forward in the UN ECOSOC to see if that can indeed be an instrument that can be formalized and make formally accessible to UN members. And that takes an alternative approach to expedite the introduction of new UN model provisions into existing bilateral treaties. So that's an interesting one to watch. So let's see it also there. So though the mechanism is different, the mechanism is meant to be a bit easier, still take two to tango. So you would still need agreement between the bilateral contracting states. But it's another new one that is there on the horizon. And you might also be thinking, how is this then different from that other process that I've heard about? That is the work on the UN Framework Convention that has also started, at least in terms of coming up with a mandate for negotiations. So the UN General Assembly at the end of 23 decided to come up with a intergovernmental process, so process that is sort of separate from that process of experts, and to come with a process that would lead to potentially a UN framework convention on tax cooperation. So that could initially mean anything. So the first thing that they also did, and that was the work of this calendar year 24, is to come up with a scoping note or a mandate of what future negotiations on such a framework convention could entail. That work was completed over August, and the document that you see here as a screenshot, that was agreed by a so-called ad hoc group of members initially, so a smaller drafting group, and then was voted on by all members of the United Nations in a committee setting. And that document describes what a UN framework convention at high level could look like from a procedural point of view, but also identify a couple of topics that this framework convention would address. And those topics would be addressed through so-called protocols, protocols that would be added to this framework convention. And that would include, at least that's how I imagine it, a lot of substantive provisions. So substantive provisions to be developed. So those could be provisions that, again, differ from what we know from tax treaties. So one of the topics that they are planning to develop potentially is a new approach to taxing cross-border services. So suppose they get to a new setup or new approach to taxing cross-border services, you would need to make sure that that new agreement would take precedence over what is included in existing bilateral tax treaties. So also that convention in some way would need to modify or amend existing treaties. So also there will be a question on how will the legal setup of that convention will actually work. But we're definitely not there yet, because what is only yet to start is now the negotiations on the convention itself. That is still dependent on a formal vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations. On the right-hand side, you see a screenshot of the voting pattern in committee. So when it was still at a low level of the decision-making process. Interesting to see there is that the Global South supported this negotiation mandate and this whole approach, and also supported the start of the negotiations early next year and completion of the negotiations by 2027. You see that EU countries have abstained, so they did not like it. They had a lot of concerns. There are also a few countries, including the US and the United Kingdom, who voted against. It is also expected that they will vote against when this is up for a vote in the General Assembly, but this will not stop the process. And this is also because, and that's sort of the final remark I wanted to make, because of a fundamental difference in the way the UN versus the OECD develops tax standards and tax rules. Everything that we talked about thus far in this session in relation to the OECD was based on the OECD processes around consensus building. So at least from a formal perspective, you have countries participating on an equal footing. That means that one country, one vote, but there's never really voting, because in principle, something is only considered approved if there is a full backing of all members of what is now the inclusive framework. So that's how the OECD works. There's of course an exception with the peer review. Peer review, it's always consensus -1, because otherwise the reviewed country could block its own report. But that's the setup of the OECD. That's different from the United Nations. So in principle, within the United Nations, they strive towards consensus, but if consensus cannot be found, there is a voting procedure. And in principle, we are then dealing with simple majority voting. And that is what has happened thus far with this UN Framework Convention. How this would work going forward is a bit of a different question. So in principle, under majority voting, you can even get to the text of a framework convention in the next couple of years, but then the text will be on the table. And then, of course, it will still be up to the individual states to sign and ratify that convention. So, in other words, even if that the text is on the table and it has those protocols on different ways of taxing services, it will only amend existing treaty relationships or treaties if, again, the two countries that have a tax treaty in place have danced their little tango. And I'm saying that again from Buenos Aires. So it takes two to tango, as a matter of fact, there as well, for these new provisions of the Future Framework Convention to apply in their bilateral relationship. So that's a very big topic, I think, for the next few years. So the MLI will continue to be out there. It's out there in space. So we as tax practitioners will need to deal with it. But we need to keep an eye on all those additional developments that might be coming away. So if you're also giving sort of tax advice on the longer term, be aware of what the position on the tax treaty is now, how the MLI has come into place or might come into place soon in a bilateral treaty. But be aware that those other conventions might be coming there as well. The SCTR may kick in. That tax certainty instrument may come from the OECD. Fast track instrument of the UN and potentially the UN Framework Convention. And I think that brings me at the end of my contribution. So I hope that I managed to provide a little bit more insight in the background of the MLI that you will be diving into, but also into what more is to come. Thanks a lot for your time. Happy to address any sort of questions quickly, either now or in writing. So the IFA India team knows how to reach out to me.
Thank you, Maikel. I don't see any questions which are there, and I guess I think because you're on vacation, I think it's only fair we let you get back to your travels. I think it was a wonderful session where you took us not only through the history and how things have happened, but also gave us a very good outlook into what is happening now and what will happen in the coming future. And I'm sure the words of advice which you had for tax consultants and tax professionals is going to be very telling, that things are not over. A lot of things are still coming. So, and I think your insights with the background which you have on the work which you've done with the MLI would be really helpful to set the tone for the next session and for the workshop as a whole. So it's a good. I think you nailed the mandate for the session with giving us a great overview for the entire MLI exercise. And on behalf of all the participants and IFA India, would like to extend our appreciation and thanks for taking the time and being here today. And wish you safe travels.
Thanks a lot. It was a great pleasure, and enjoy the rest of the course.
Thank you. Prerna, I'll hand over the session to you.
Sure. I think we can take a quick break of 10 minutes and we start again at 6:45.
Sure. Ganesh sir, I think you've joined, so we'll start in 10 minutes. So you can
Sorry,
you can
10
stay
minutes.
longer.
I'm joining in through my mobile and
Okay.
presenting to my laptop in case any problem, because my video is causing some trouble.
No issue, sir. We'll let you know in case there's some issue.
Fine. 10 minutes. Okay. Fine.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we can start the session now. We're at 6:45, which is the scheduled time. And I think all the participants are also here.
Yes. So welcome, Ganesh sir. I'll just quickly introduce Ganesh sir. So Ganesh sir is practicing into international taxation, and he has in fact recently developed a MLI toolkit, which is MLI Decoded, which captures the positions of India and its treaty partners with respect to the substantive articles of the MLI. He has authored so many papers, and he has contributed even on the topic of the multilateral instrument for the compendium on the MLI published by the Bombay Chartered Accountants Society. He has also presented a paper on the tax treaties and the MLI interpretation and interplay. And he has been a regular speaker at various forums. So welcome, Ganesh sir, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. It's nice to be once more in an IFA seminar, and that too on MLI, which is a topic which strangely I seem to be have developed a liking and a continued interest on the topic. Strangely, because the topic is, or the language of the multilateral instrument is so complex, and it's quite maddening for anybody to try to make some sense out of it. And once you believe that you have made some sense, some reasonable sense, then you don't want to let go of it. So now I'm in the same process for Pillar 2 also, and I'm trying to make sense of it. As of now, it is still work in progress. But soon I believe that MLA would have competition in Pillar 2. So with this, I believe that this is one of the earlier sessions of the course, of the workshop. So my portion or my syllabus is to discuss the understanding with which we'll look at MLI, what the MLI is, what is the animal, and how are we supposed to look at it, and how it is going to impact our double tax avoidance agreements, if at all, and if so, to what extent, and then how do we read the multilateral instrument and the double tax avoidance agreements, the relevant provisions, to make sense of the changes which we can expect going forward. One preliminary remark is basically, yeah, I'm sharing it. Yeah, one preliminary remark is basically that the MLI, the changes being brought about by MLI are not very wide in spectrum, or very having a broad effect across the treaty provisions. There are few pockets of abuse which the OECD picked up as part of its BEPS program, and they have taken this opportunity to address those particular abusive practices in the MLI. So you will find that there are smatterings of changes, some in Article 4 for transparent entities, some in Article 13 for capital gains, some would be basically on dividends. So there are some few baskets which are totally unrelated or unconnected with each other than the abusive practices which the OECD seeks to plug through this instrument. And of course, we have the PPT, the principal purpose test, which is equivalent to the treaty GAR, which is pervasive, but that also is a particularly an address to address the abusive treatment of abusive practices followed by taxpayers through treaty provisions. Now we have 1 hour, 10 minutes. So I will keep it brief. I would, of course, like interactions. I'll appreciate questions coming from the participants. So I know that I'm getting across to what I've set out to do. So basically, we'll deal with the MLI, its nature and impact. What are these reservations and notifications which we have all over the MLI substantive articles? What is this compatibility we talk, which is mentioned in every other substantive articles, and the famous synthesized texts and how useful they are. This is what we will discuss. I will take few examples from India's treaties to drive home some points. The conclusions are all, of course, all mine. We do not have any precedents, or we do not have any great literature, even from the India perspective, how the MLI will affect the India's treaties. But I've taken the plunge in and putting my neck out and coming out with some conclusions, which, of course, any of you can disagree with. So, what is this MLI? The multilateral instrument, Action 15 of the BEPS action plans. The mandate was to the ad hoc group which developed action, which the Action 15 gave that mandate was the group shall develop multilateral instruments to modify existing bilaterals solely in order to swiftly implement the tax treaty measures developed in the course of the OECD G20 BEPS project. This was the mandate. It was not a mandate to renegotiate the action plans or the agreements which the ad hoc group had arrived at, but it was to develop an instrument to implement those measures which are treaty related in a swift manner. Swift manner because there are more than 3,000 bilateral treaties across the world, bilateral and multilateral tax treaties across the world, to expect all the countries will sit together and again redraft those treaties was would have been very challenging. So the OECD G20 project had envisaged that there will be a multilateral instrument which will be used to impact the tax treaty measures arrived at in the BEPS project, impacting the double tax avoidance agreements, bilateral or multilateral. So we'll largely discuss bilateral treaties because that is what we are all familiar with. So Action 15 plan was in that regard. It was to develop a multilateral instrument to implement the BEPS measures, BEPS treaty-related measures. There are several BEPS measures which are not treaty-related, we'll not talk about today because that MLI will have no role to play in them. So what does MLI do? MLI, as said in the explanatory statement, operates to modify tax treaties. It will not function in the same way as an amending protocol. So this is not a protocol. MLI will not amend treaties. They will modify treaties. Instead, it will be applied alongside existing tax treaties, modifying their application. You will have both the MLI document, you will have the double tax avoidance treaty, the applicable or the relevant double tax avoidance treaty which you are dealing with. You keep both alongside each other and then try to make sense out of the provisions. So you will find words like in the MLI, you will find words like this provision will apply in place of, will apply in addition to, or this provision will be replaced by. A provision of CTA will be replaced by a provision in the MLI. which is quite what I would say confusing, but the words of in place of or replaced by will have to be given the meaning as envisaged by the multilateral instrument as a document, which is it will modify the existing CTAs and it will be applied alongside existing tax treaties, and it will not. They are not amending protocols, so existing treaties will remain unchanged, but not unimpacted. So this is a basic premise we have to keep in mind when we look at MLI. So basically, one description of MLI has been given by John F. Avery Johns. He says MLI contains provisions substituting for those in CTA without incorporating them into the CTA. Both coexist. So this is the impact, or this is the impact which you find in the MLI provision, in the CTA provision because of MLI, but the old provisions remain. The new provisions have to be read alongside the old provisions. That is the way in which we will read MLI. Now, MLI being a treaty, will obviously the Vienna Convention will have a role to play in understanding MLI. But for the matter, even in understanding CTS, this is all like now well settled that VCLT is a customary international practices which are codified and which will not be followed while interpreting treaties, which would be both CTA as well as MLI. What are the basic interpretation clause articles in the Vienna Convention? Ordinary meaning to be given to the terms of the treaty in their context and in the light of its object and purpose. Supplementary means of interpretation, including preparatory work and circumstances of its conclusion, to confirm the meaning resulting from application of Article 31 and or to determine the meaning when interpretation according to the article leaves the meaning ambiguous or obscure or leads to absurd or unreasonable results. So this is the basic rules of interpretation in Vienna Convention, which we will have some chance to look at a little more closely for various aids to interpretation which we find in the MLI and the attending and the accompanying documents. What are these various documents? We have MLI preamble. The preamble of the MLI itself is in context because that is as per Article 31. Context includes the preamble. So there is no confusion there. Now, the MLI preamble talks about the BEPS project, talks about the treaty-related measures which are going to be implemented in the BEPS project, whereby indirectly we will have the entire action reports of the BEPS project becoming useful in interpreting the MLI. MLI, the substantive articles of MLI, as well as the impact those articles have on CTAs. So we also have explanatory statement to the MLI. This was prepared by the group of negotiators. It was prepared along with the signing of the MLI as a document. But explanatory statement is not intended to address the interpretation of underlying BEPS measures. Explanatory statement is to explain the operation of the MLI rather than explain the tax treaty related BEPS measures which are sought to be introduced through the MLI. They are, of course, supplementary means of interpretation since they form the circumstances of its conclusion. Because of the MLI, the explanatory statement was agreed to by the group of negotiators who more or less would be the same as the signatories of the MLI. Though, of course, that conclusion is a presumption, is my presumption. I do not know who the group of negotiators were and whether they all were signatories, but then there's hardly any confusion there in the sense that you have an explanatory statement coming along at the same time as the MLI was signed. One can easily come to the conclusion that, of course, you need to look at the explanatory statement to understand the operation of MLI. The context for interpreting MLI, yes, is it the explanatory statement is the context for interpreting the MLI since it reflects the agreed understanding of the negotiators. This is what I was telling you earlier. This comes out of the Conference of Parties opinion of 2021. MLA document itself envisages a conference of parties whereby some or all members, signatories of the MLI come together, or they join in a conference to address specific issues. And there are some 3 or 4 COP opinions which have been issued till now. And one opinion, which is the 2021 opinion, talks about explanatory statement to be the context of the MLI. So obviously, it has to be while interpreting MLI, we need to look at the explanatory statement, but keeping in mind that the explanatory statement is not intended to address interpretation of the underlying BEPS measures, except of course arbitration, the mandatory arbitration provisions. Since India has not chosen to opt for the mandatory arbitration provision, so for us it is not really relevant. As far as action reports are concerned, action reports, as I said earlier, the preamble is the MLI preamble refers to the BEPS project and the action reports, of which the action reports are the outcome. So obviously, action reports will amount to object and purpose of the MLI rather than the context. So the difference would be basically when I look at a particular provision of CTA as modified by MLI, I will keep the object and purpose of the underlying BEPS action plan to understand the extent of change or to interpret the provisions after interpret the provisions so modified. So which is how the action reports are important to understand the changes which will, or the changes, I'm saying the word changes in a loose sense, as I said, the modification which will happen through the operation of MLI on those provisions. So action reports are important, as they give you the object and purpose of the MLI. OECD model commentaries are supplementary means of interpretation which has been held. They are persuasive, but one has to keep in mind that the entire 2017 update of the OECD model happened or was issued after the signature of the MLI. So basically, to call it a supplementary means of interpretation to understand MLI would be a misnomer, but there is a good amount of what I would say, a good amount of changes in the OECD 2017 updates which are drawn from the action reports. To the extent there is no change in those paragraphs in the commentary, apart from of course the numbering of the paragraphs, one can rely on the commentary. But where there are changes to the commentary, or there are changes in the commentary which are not reflected in the OECD action reports, then of course one needs to be cautious while using those paragraphs to interpret MLI or a CTA provision read with them. CTAs themselves are in our context, there's no doubt, because without a CTA, the MLI will have no operation at all. CTAs are basically covered tax agreements. So obviously, CTAs are context for understanding MLI. And lastly, the statements issued by the Conference of Parties, they could be persuasive, yes, but they have a very limited value. Why? Because Conference of Parties the statements issued by the Conference of Parties cannot be seen as a subsequent agreement of the parties concerned, of the bilateral treaties, or for that matter even of the MLI. The reason is Conference of Parties, the operation, how the Conference of Parties works is not very clear. What is the quorum? In what way the voting happens? How the statements are decided by consensus or otherwise? Those aspects are not clear. It's quite possible that there could be a Conference of Party where large number of signatories of the MLI would not attend. So to say that a statement issued by a Conference of Parties is a subsequent agreement to the MLI would be a stretch, So I believe it will have a very limited role. Would have, of course, persuasive impact. Like we did discuss one or two statements of conference of parties to understand what MLI is in our earlier slides. Now let's come to undefined terms in the MLI. So the Article 2.2 of the MLI says that whatever terms are undefined, the meaning of such terms in the relevant CTA is to be taken into account. Now, this is something similar to Article 3.2 in a double tax avoidance agreement. Similar words, unless the context otherwise requires. Now, so basically, if I have some words or some terms in the MLI which are not defined, there are hardly any definitions in the MLI. So if we find any term which is not there and not defined in the MLI, then we go to the relevant CTA. And if that term is defined, then of course we adopt that meaning, adopt the meaning of that term as per that definition. If the CTA takes you back to the domestic law, even then you can use that meaning to understand the term used in the MLI. But of course, there is a slight hitch in this, that where a term is not used in the CTA, is the domestic law meaning barred? Means, am I to understand a term in the MLI? Let us say a term in the MLI is being used for the first time. Let us say complementary functions and cohesive business operations, which is used in the anti-fragmentation rule. Now, this term or this expression is not used in a CTA. In a normal double tax avoidance agreement, we don't find these terms. So the term is not used, which would mean you would not be able to apply Article 3.2, which would mean that you cannot apply the meaning of those terms under the domestic law if such meaning exists. That would be a very myopic way of looking at things. The way I would look at it is basically when a CTA gets modified by the MLI, those terms now occur in the CTA, occur not in the sense of actually in ink, but in an understanding of a CTA provision, you need to look at those provisions, which would mean they are the terms now in the CTA. So you are not barred from accessing or going to a domestic law meaning as given under Article 3.2 of the relevant CTA. So I would believe that we cannot have an interpretation by which will bar a term used in the MLI, which will bar use of a domestic law meaning of a term used in the MLI. So now, after we have understood or had a look at what MLI is and how MLI is to be read, that is read along with the CTA, we will have to look at what is called a compatibility clauses in the MLI. What do they mean by the compatibility clauses? So now what we have is we have an MLI and a CTA, both simultaneously applicable. Both will operate at the same time, both coexist. So there are two treaties. One is the CTA and the second is the subsequent treaty, both coexisting. There is a possibility that both the treaties cannot be given effect to, which is basically what is called the impossibility of joint compliance test. If both the provisions cannot be given effect to, it is impossible to jointly to comply with both the provisions at the same time. That indicates conflict. So now there are several provisions where you will find MLI modifying the CTA provision. So this modification rule given in this MLI is nothing but a conflict rule in the MLI. So you can't have, let us say, an anti-fragmentation rule in the MLI, which is not there in the CTA. So now if in the absence of an anti-fragmentation rule in the CTA, I apply an anti-fragmentation rule in the MLI, and there's a conflict between the two. Give me a simple, exemplified example. So obviously, the MLI wants you to apply anti-fragmentation rule in wherever applicable, which means the conflict is getting resolved. So this impossibility of joint compliance is where when a state is a party to two or more treaty regimes, and either the mere existence of or the actual performance under one treaty will frustrate the purpose of another treaty. This is the conflict they are talking about. The conflict rules given in the MLI resolve this in the sense that they give a priority of application of the two equally applicable. So what is the priority of application? Like, let's take an example of a tiebreaker test in Article 4, Para 3 of OECD model, which is applicable in India's treaties also, where place of effective management is the tiebreaker for a company or a non-corporate, non-individual. So in such a case, the Article 4.1 of the MLI says, in case of tiebreaker, in case of dual residents, it will be the competent authorities who will decide and mutually agree to which state the particular company belongs to, or a company or a non-individual would be resident of for treaty purposes. So now here you have a conflict. Treaty says, the double tax treaty says point. MLI's Article 4.1 says competent authority decision on where that particular non-individual is resident. So you have a conflict. You can't operate both at the same time. So you will need to take give a priority, and the priority is what is called the lex posterior rule, which is basically a treaty later in time will override the earlier treaty. But this is a principle given for treaty interpretation. This is nothing but a residual rule for treaty interpretation. In the MLI, this rule is codified. The MLI says, in case of dual resident companies or dual resident entities, you will follow a competent authority consultation to decide on where the particular person is resident, or which contracting state the person is resident of. You give the place of effective management the go by. So in effect, the compatibility, the MLI compatibility clause says, in case of where the Article 4.1 applies, you do not look at the point, you look at the competent authority decision to decide on the treaty residents. So in effect, the conflict rules in the MLI, these are the conflict rules in the MLI, the compatibility clauses, which decide that the MLI article will have priority over the CTA provision. So in effect, this conflict gets resolved. Right. So but also in certain MLI provisions, you will find certain such and such notification has not happened. In that case, the MLI provision will supersede to the extent of incompatibility. This term you will find in several substantive articles, compatibility clauses. What does this mean? Supersedes to the extent of incompatibility. This is the residual rule given in the MLI. That's lex posterior rule, that in case of incompatibility, the MLI provision will supersede. Now, what is incompatible? That you cannot jointly comply with both the treaty rule, the TTAA rule, as well as the MLI. In such a case, there's an incompatibility. In such a case, you apply the MLI and not the CT. All easy to understand. Now let us look at some interesting applications to the whole thing. Of course, before we even go there about the conflict, the first question is there a conflict? This is a very important slide, and one or two examples are given going forward on India's CTAs to understand about whether there is a conflict. So why this question is even arising? So in the law of treaties, I can't pronounce this person, Harsh Lauterpacht. He talks about this. Is there a conflict as a question? He says very often an inconsistency, a conflict will be no more than a divergence or a variation with regard to the scope of the treaty and the method of its application. Just read the red fonts. On occasion, the apparent conflict resolves itself upon analysis into no more than assumption of additional obligations. Then he gives an example of a Pact of Paris, where there was an obligation on the signatories that they were prohibited from using war as an instrument of national policy. While you had the League of Nations, which allowed war in certain contingencies, like let's say the failure of the council to make a valid recommendation or whatever dispute falls out of the domestic jurisdiction, whatever would be the reason. But war is not prohibited under the League of Nations. It's allowed war in certain circumstances. So there, what her Lauter Pact says is there was in fact no such conflict. There merely existed an additional obligation under the Pact of Paris, an obligation clearly not inconsistent with the covenant. It is a covenant of the League of Nations. That is, the Pact of Paris prohibited war as an instrument of, prohibited having countries having war as an instrument of their national policy, but they are not prevented from going to war. So they have an obligation not to make that their national policy, that's all. So there is really no conflict. This is the way this has been interpreted. Why I'm using all these examples is you can draw some similarity to our discussion going forward on the interpretation of whether there is conflict. Now, it's clear in certain cases there is no conflict at all. What is this? Like basically India-Japan Treaty is an example. Your Article 4 of the CTA, that is your residence article. There is no tiebreaker test for individuals. So now you have Article 4.1 of the MLI, which gives a competent authority decision for deeming which country the person is resident of, will apply to only non-individuals. So as far as individuals are concerned, there is no conflict. So if I try to put both together, I have 4.2 of the CTA here. Then I have paraphrased it. In case where such person is other than an individual, the competent authorities shall endeavor to. So as far as the individuals are concerned, I don't have to go to the competent authority mechanism to identify where they are resident. So basically here, there is no conflict as far as the individuals are concerned. And as far as non-individuals, that is cleared. Now you go to the competent authorities to determine where that fellow is resident of. Right. So basically, resolving a tiebreaker is not addressed by MLI Article 4. CTA provisions will remain unchanged to the extent as applicable for individuals. So let's proceed further. Defining the scope of the conflict is also very interesting. You have, see, there's so much of matter on the screen, so it does not get overwhelmed by it. It is basically, I have reproduced the provision, CTA provision, I have reproduced the MLI relevant parts of the changes in the CTA provision as modified by MLI. And last column is the compatibility clause. I just extracted the certain portions so that we can easily refer to these portions on the screen, and you can follow my thought process. So here we have 27.1 relates to your sort of the so-called PPT test is got introduced now after this. Earlier it was a test whereby can I say an anti-abuse test? I'll call that. So in 27.1 we had a resident of a contracting state derives income from the other state shall not be entitled to relief from taxation, otherwise provided for in this agreement if it was the main purpose, and there's some meaning. Something further. Then anyway, now 27.2 says, in making determination under para 1, the appropriate competent authority or authorities shall be entitled to consider, among other factors, the amount and nature of income, circumstances in which the income was derived, the stated intention of the parties to the transaction, and the identity and the residence of the persons. So basically, I have given certain criteria to determine whether there is basically the main purpose of the transaction or the person or the main purpose of the person was to get relief from taxation from that treaty. So these criteria, additional criteria, helped the competent authorities to come to that conclusion. Now what happened? You had both Finland and India both notifying para 1 and para 2 of Article 27, which gets replaced, which applies, or the Article 7.1, that is your PBT, applies in place of these two paragraphs. That's what your compatibility clause says. So what has happened is, if you read the India-Finland synthesis text, the India version as well as the Finnish version, they both refer to 27.1 and 27.2 as being in square brackets, and you have the new article, which is the new PPT article, will apply in place of those two paragraphs. So in effect, what happens is, these attendant circumstances, which are useful to determine the main purpose of a particular person or a particular transaction, are now given the go by. At least they are not available. So now, is that the correct reading of this provision? So here, what we have, guidance to apply the anti-avoidance rule, is it in conflict? If as the competent authority, or if the competent authority takes on all these criteria to understand what the main purpose of the transaction was. And even otherwise, would not the authorities take those into account when they do the assessment? Or for the matter, would not the assessee or would not the taxpayer use these criteria to establish that the arrangement was, that the benefit is in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant provisions of the agreement? So what I would look at, the way I would look at this whole provision is, we have Article 27.1 and 27.2, they are not deleted, they remain. Underneath that, you have the PPT rule that is coming from MLI Article 7.1. I will keep all three together, and I will say this will apply in place of the compatibility rule, what we discussed, the conflict rule. Apply in place of or in absence of CTA provisions that deny all or part of the benefits that would otherwise be provided under the CTA. So what is getting replaced, if I can use the word, are the CTA provisions that deny all or part of the benefits that would otherwise be provided under the CTA. They don't deny application of these guidance factors. So this is the extent of understanding we need to probably develop, at least in my view. It is not a simple deleting certain paragraphs and adding certain paragraphs of the MLI. Try to understand both alongside each other and make sense out of the compatibility clause and see what gets modified. Of course, one can also argue that in making the determination under para 1 is what it says. So that those terms probably would rule out continuation of 27.2. So that is another side of the argument. It is possible that one can say that 27.2 is linked to 27.1. Once 27.1 gets replaced by your PPT rule of the MLA Article 7.1, your 27.2 also goes out of the window. But I would believe that will be a very narrow way of looking at things. The guidance are to help the authorities as well as the tax authorities to establish the main purpose, as well as the taxpayer to defend the main purpose. So really to say that these factors are now deleted might be a stretch. Coming to that, is there a conflict aspect which we discussed, that the Pact of Paris? Let us look at this. This is a very interesting provision, and we need to spend some time on it, but it's not very complex. Again, so much of matter on the screen, it could be a little overwhelming, but please look at the red portions. That is what I want to draw your attention to. The bold portions are basically the modifications which I have what I will say, transplanted to on the existing CTA article. Synthesized text does not do this. Synthesized text gives you the existing article and the new MLI provisions in a box. There is no transplanting of both together and coming out with the conclusion. So now let us look at this. Now here, the bold ones are all coming from the article MLI article 13 option A, 13.2 option A. Now, question is, in the existing article 5.4, this paragraph appears. The preceding provisions of this paragraph shall not apply where an enterprise of one of the states maintains in the other state a fixed place of business for any purpose other than those specified in this paragraph. There is an additional condition, added condition. You do not find this condition normally in P&A activities, right? So you do not find these conditions normally in the P&A activities. So you have this new condition, or this the old pre-existing condition is there. Now what will be the result after applying the MLI provision is the question. Now you look at article 13.2. Article 13.2 gives the compatibility clause for option A. Article 13.5A, article 13.2 is the option A, and article 13.5A gives the compatibility clause. It says, MLI, that is 13.5A says, 13.2 shall apply in place of the relevant parts of the CTA provisions that list specific activities. Relevant parts are A to E. That's an added condition. If there is a fixed place of business in that country, other than any other fixed place of business in the other country, maintains in other contracting state a fixed place of business for any purpose other than those specified in this paragraph, then you don't get the benefit of this exemption. This is the existing provision. Now, is the existing extra additional condition omitted by adopting option A? Option A does not contain these conditions. This is an extra condition. So, but the compatibility clause says 13.5A, 13.2, there is option A, shall apply in place of the relevant parts of the CTA that list specific activities that are deemed not to constitute PE, even if activities are constituted through a fixed place of business. So basically, option A is silent about any additional condition like these. You will find in some treaties these additional conditions, around 5-7 treaties I saw. So now, this additional condition, even otherwise, is not incompatible with the option A. The additional conditions have been agreed to bilaterally by the countries, by India and Australia. When the original TTAA was entered into, it has been bilaterally agreed that this condition should exist. And for all its even for all its name as a multilateral instrument, a multilateral instrument has got bilateral effect. Ultimately, what does a multilateral instrument do? It affects bilateral treaties. It has only bilateral effect. It affects the contracting states who are signatories to a CTA. So keeping that in mind, you would have a bilateral condition which has been pre-agreed to between India and Australia will continue to exist in the CTA as modified by the MLI. This is my conclusion. Because there is no incompatibility in, or for the matter, I would say this relevant parts of the CTA provisions that list specific activities do not include additional conditions. The modification would be of the relevant parts of the CTA provisions that list specific activities. So I would believe that extra condition will continue. There is no problem. There is because that is to be respected. It is there as per the bilateral understanding of India and Australia. Now let us go further. Para 4.1, or the para, I'm naming it para 4.1. Basically, it is a new paragraph for the anti-fragmentation rule. What is the anti-fragmentation rule? It's nothing but we have a preparatory and auxiliary character exemptions available. So you would have a particular taxpayer, non-resident taxpayer, splitting up all his activities, fragmenting all his activities into smaller and smaller areas which are individually are all preparatory and auxiliary, preparatory or auxiliary, thereby bypassing or thereby circumventing the P&A, circumventing the constitution of a P. So now to prevent that from happening, an anti-fragmentation rule has been brought in, which says the exemption given in P&A paragraph, this paragraph 4, shall not apply to a fixed place of business that is used or maintained by an enterprise if the same enterprise or a closely related enterprise carries on business activities at the same place or at another place in the same contracting state, and that place constitutes a P for the enterprise or the other enterprise. So basically, if I have another place of business, which is a P, of course, the second paragraph, I'm not getting into that. I'm keeping the problem statement simple. I have another place of business, which is a P. Anti-fragmentation rule says, oh, if that is a P, then this exemption which you were entitled to under option A, read with the existing P&A activities, will not be available. But that is exactly what the additional condition also said. The pre-existing additional condition also says the same thing, that if you have another place of business, then for any purpose other than those specified in this paragraph, which would mean that P&A exemption will not be available to you for the P&A activities. But there's a slight twist in the tail. You have anti-fragmentation rule putting a condition that in the proviso that the business activities carried on by the two enterprises at the same place or by the same enterprises or the CRE at two places constitute complementary functions that are part of a cohesive business operation. This is a requirement of the anti-fragmentation rule. This is not the requirement of the pre-existing additional condition. The fixed place, there has to be only a fixed place, then your P&A exemption at that place or any other place will not be available. While here, same will not be available, provided the activities constitute complementary functions that are part of a cohesive business operation. This is a limitation to the exclusion. So this limitation constituting complementary functions that are part of cohesive business operations is absent in the pre-existing condition. So now question is, Australia has opted for anti-fragmentation rule, so has India. So anti-fragmentation rule comes and sits in my Article 5. Question is that in conflict with the pre-existing condition? Now, that's the question. Now here you have Article 13.4 shall apply, that's the compatibility clause. Article 13.4 is anti-fragmentation rule, shall apply to provisions of the CTA as they may be modified. That's all it says. It doesn't say anything else. So basically you have anti-fragmentation rule in para 4 of Article 13 of the MLI will now apply to the provisions of the CTA. When they apply to the provisions of the CTA, can both apply together? One says such extra place of business should be constituting complementary functions that are part of cohesive business operations for you to be denied the P&A exemption, while the pre-existing condition does not say anything of the nature. So I would believe the existing additional condition, whether affected by application of option A, no, there's no conflict. But AFR, only if activities of additional place only if activities at additional place constitute complementary functions part of cohesive business operations. So this topic needs to be resolved. Otherwise, what will happen is you will have anti-fragmentation rule becoming redundant, OTOs, especially OTOs in case of a same enterprise having another place of business. In case of a CRE having another place of business, it will still continue to have relevance. So I would believe it has to be the additional paragraph will need to be read with the condition constituting complementary functions that are part of cohesive business operations, because otherwise you cannot make harmonious reading of the pre-existing condition and the new anti-fragmentation rule. There are at least one treaty I can tell you, Bulgaria, which has opted for option A Article 13, but has not opted for anti-fragmentation rule. There also this additional condition is there, the same additional condition of having a fixed place of business in another fixed place of business, similar conditions. But I would believe there is no conflict, it can continue. So for the same extra conditions, I came to the conclusion that there are two different interpretations possible. Any questions on that? Please do sound me out. Otherwise, it will become. Hello.
Yes, sir. There is one question at a previous stage. The question is that the participant has asked for a few examples where there are more than one treaty, one being a CTA and then another one for in any particular country which is a treaty partner with India. So more than just the CTA, MLI, and then more treaties.
No, basically a CTA. At least my understanding is a CTA is nothing but both the countries notifying each other's treaties, notifying their bilateral treaty, bilateral or multilateral. That's all. So that becomes a covered tax agreement. Now, if it's a CTA, then MLI will have any impact. If it's any other treaty, let us say it is not notified. Let us say India, Mauritius. India has notified Mauritius. India has notified Mauritius in its list of covered tax agreements, while Mauritius has not notified India. In such a case, the India-Mauritius agreement is not a CTA. If it is not a CTA, MLI has no role to play. I hope I answered Vijayji's question. I hope I understood it correctly. Yeah, okay, fine. He says yes. So let's proceed. So now we are talking about conflicts. Now let us look at one other example where we have this conflict coming in. United Kingdom has, of course, minimum standards and all we have discussed. So people would be aware of what the modern minimum standards. Your PPT rule is a minimum standard. Both India and UK have notified it. Now, question is, UK has notified Article 12, Para 7 as being modified by the PPT rule. Article 12, Para 7 is in the royalty article, where the main purpose or one of the main purposes with the creation or assignment of rights, in respect of which royalties or FTAs are paid, to take advantage of this article by means of the creation or assignment. UK believes that this article, this paragraph gets modified, impacted by Article 7.1 of the MLI, the PPT rule, while India has not notified it. India has not notified this paragraph, 12.7. India has notified some other paragraph, but not this paragraph. So basically what will happen? Whether this paragraph will continue to exist or not. Now, Article 7.1, the compatibility clause is given in 7.2. It says, 7.1 is the PPT rule, shall apply in place of or in the absence of CTA provisions that deny all or part of the benefits that would otherwise be provided under the CTA. That's what it says. So, and then there's a further condition that basically here, one, the PPT rule talks about benefit shall not be granted in respect of an item of income or capital if it is reasonable to conclude that obtaining the benefit was one of the principal purposes of any arrangement or transaction that resulted directly or indirectly in the benefit, unless it is established that granting that benefit in these circumstances would be in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant portions of this agreement. So basically, there is a primary obligation of the tax authority to allege that the main purpose or one of the principal purposes of any arrangement that resulted directly or indirectly in the benefit is the main purpose of the arrangement was to result in the benefit, while the taxpayer has an opportunity to establish that granting that benefit was in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant portions of the agreement. In 12.7, the existing paragraph, it talks about main purpose, and one of the main purposes was to take advantage of this article. there's no mitigating rule like we have in the PPT. It is established, unless it is established that granting the benefit in these circumstances would be in accordance with the object and purpose. So you have UK saying, no, this also gets modified by MLI, which means you're giving an opportunity to the taxpayer to establish that the relief or advantage taken by him of the treaty, the India-UK treaty, is in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant provisions of that treaty. That opportunity is not there in 12.7. UK says, now this paragraph goes, so basically you have a general PPT test, and for royalty and FTS also, you will only look at the general PPT test. While India says, no, we have this additional condition, which is different from the PPT test, which is there. So now we have a conflict of interpretation. Now both the countries have given their synthesis text, and both have acknowledged that they have a different understanding as regards para 12.7, as well as also we have the similar paragraphs in interest article and the dividend article. Now this 12.7, there's a history behind it. It is basically to restrict source taxation to bona fide arrangements. This para really is not in conflict with the PPT rule, right? Unless the main purpose test is to unless main purpose test to take advantage of articles treated as absolute. So basically, if you look at Article 12.7, it's absolute. Once the main purpose is to take advantage, then you lose the benefit of the treaty for that item of income. Which is, while in case of Article 7, Para 1 of the MLI, the PPT rule, you have an opportunity to prove that the benefit which you derived was in accordance with the object and purpose of the relevant portions of the agreement. So now what happens? MLI 7.1 will supersede to the extent of incompatibility. MLI article or the Article 7.1 there's no repeal or abrogation or derogation of the CTA. As I said, there is no amendment to the CTA. There's only a modification. You have to keep both together and read. So you have 12.7 continuing even after a PPT rule is introduced. But the conflict arises when at the time of implementing 12.7, India says that the main purpose of the arrangement was to take advantage of the treaty and stops there. India does not give the taxpayer the opportunity to establish, or even if the taxpayer establishes, India that it is in the benefit is in accordance with the object and purpose of the 11 portions of the agreement. India says no, that those words are not there in 12.7. I will stop here. Once the main purpose is to take advantage, then you fall foul. You will not get the benefit of Article 12. That interpretation will be in conflict with the Article 7.1. So basically, how would I read it is basically as long as India reads 12.7 and gives the ability to establish that the benefit derived, the main purpose though might be to get the benefit of the treaty, the benefit derived would be in accordance with the object and purpose of the 11 portions of the agreement. There is no conflict. But if India does not, India stops here, and absolutely it says Article 12.7 is not modified, so we stop here. So you don't get an opportunity to establish that it's in accordance with the provisions of the object and purpose of the convention of the CTA. Then that will be in conflict, which will be superseded by Article 7.1. So what does this bring out? It brings out that these rules are not rules of interpretation. They are basically norms for application. At the time of application, you need to understand whether the particular articles has been, the modification has been complied with. So you do not, it is not as if like a particular paragraph gets substituted by the MLI paragraph. They both coexist. At the time of application of the particular provision of the CTA, as modified by the MLI, you need to give effect to the provisions of the CTA. Provisions of the MLI, which is basically the PPT rule, including the ability to establish for the taxpayer that granting the benefit would be in accordance with the provisions of the convention. Now, this is a purely my view. Otherwise, you would have a conflict and such a conflict will get resolved. How, I do not know. This is the only way you can redress or even redress the difference between the two interpretations given by the two countries. Otherwise, you will have, in India, you will have a particular application of Article 12.7, while in the UK, they will read 12.7 as now superseded by the PPT rule. So you will have different differences and possibly double taxation. So we need to look at MLI rule as a rule of application and not a rule of interpretation. Is the short point I would say for in this case study. Now we have synthesized texts, very popular, but I would believe a very disappointing result in my personal view. I'll tell you why. So you will find the OECD, the general disclaimer is available in the synthesized text. It's primarily intended to facilitate the understanding of MLI. For legal purposes, MLI must be read alongside CTA as they remain the only legal instruments to be applied. So there is no legal basis for synthesized text. I do not know who. Of course, it must be drafted by the respective governments, by really high-ranking officials, but still, it would not be a legal text to be followed. Though it will be of use in the sense that it will have a persuasive impact. Let us say when we looked at 27.1 and 2 of India-Finland Treaty, it is possible both the countries have decided 27.2 will also be thrown out along with 27.1, and interpretation could be taken that since both the countries' synthesized texts have taken a certain stand, 27.2 will go away. But that will not be as per legal instruments. That could be an interpretation. Somebody could be persuaded to that interpretation. Now, there are variations in the synthesized texts. Some are issued independently with no reference to consultation, like India, Japan. Some are issued in consultation with the competent authority of the other state, but there is no reference to any shared understanding, while some are issued in consultation with competent authorities of the other state and represents their shared understanding. So there is a variations in the synthesized texts, and to what extent both the competent authorities are consulted and come to a shared understanding of the modifications captured in the synthesized text. So basically, I look at, now of course you look at one example would be France. In India's version of the synthesized text, it says it is a shared understanding with France, while in the French text of the synthesized text, there is no acknowledgement of shared understanding. So shared from Indian side, but not from the French side. So it's possible. So there are a lot of gaps in or rather, I would say, I would be very slow in giving it an authoritative stand, an authoritative position in interpreting MLI, and also coming to its usefulness. And this what I'm saying is not what I am saying. It is what the synthesized text itself is saying. There's a disclaimer given there. Then also it's quite possible that a tax authority themselves might not want to follow the synthesized text. There's a disclaimer. Why should they follow it? And with that in mind, why would either party, the taxpayer or the tax authority, follow synthesized text when the other one can immediately contradict and say there's a general disclaimer, so you don't look at it. Also, it's not a context to understand MLI. It is non-binding. It is not a subsequent agreement. As I said, there's a disclaimer in the ST itself. It is not a technical explanation. And there's a difference in understanding also of what is given in the synthesized text. And even otherwise, with all this, I look at the synthesized text. This is what I see. Article 13, which we discussed the example, we have 5.4. It's Article 5.4, sorry. 5.4 of the CT, India, Australia CTA. Then we have this box, which gives you the following para 2 of Article 13, which is option A of the MLI, modified by para 5.4 of this agreement. The modifies para 5.4 of this agreement, and then they just reproduce. It just reproduces the option A in Article 13. This is Article 13, para 2. Same way you have the anti-fragmentation rule below that. The following para 4 of 13 applies to para 4 of Article 5 of this as modified by the para 2 of Article 13 of the MLI. It just reproduces the MLI provisions, MLI text of the relevant substantive article underneath the CTA provision. So all that which we discussed on interpretation of the additional paragraph, this one, however, the preceding provisions of this paragraph shall not apply relating to another fixed place of business. I don't get a clue how synthesis checks will help me to resolve those confusions. So I'll skip this with the interest of time because this is anyway Naresh Rajwani is taking this at the next session. So we'll look at 1 or 2 notification mismatches. So here basically we have India-Denmark treaty, and so Vijayji has asked a question, unless in accordance with the object and purpose of the CTA. It doesn't say this. Basically, it's coming. These words are extracted out of Article 7, MLI Article 7.1. Unless it is established that it is in accordance with the object and purpose of the CTA provision. It doesn't say object and purpose of the CTA. So it's much more limited. You have to look at individual provisions, individual articles provisions, and determine what is the object and purpose of that provision, if you can even discern that, and then you can establish it that it is in accordance, that are giving you the benefit, even though your main purpose was to take that benefit. Our principal purpose was, one of the principal purposes of the principal purposes was to take benefit of that treaty. It is in accordance with the object and purpose of the CTA provision. I hope I answered Vijayji. So let's go further. There's one more question. So thank you. Okay, fine. No mention. So India-Denmark treaty. Now here what has happened? You have India. This is basically your DAP provisions, your agency P provisions. Now India has notified 5.4a, while Denmark has notified 5.4. Now, the background is this: the existing CTA provision, your Article 5.4 is basically, as I said, DAP provision. It is not the preparatory and or auxiliary activities provision. This is the one after that. He has and habitually exercises an authority to conclude contracts. Para A is what is addressed by MLI. Para B says he has no such authority but maintains stock of goods or merchandise. Para C says he habitually secures orders. B and C are not modified by Article 12 of the MLI, 12.1 and 12.2, 12.1 of the MLI. So 12.1 addresses Para A alone. We have India notifying Para A alone, while Denmark has notified the entire paragraph, 5.4. So question is there a notification mismatch? The OECD MLI matching database says there is. Right? India has notified 5.4a, Denmark has notified 5.4. Now question is, does Article 12.1, what is the compatibility rule for Article 12.1? Para 1, this is it. Para 1 shall apply in place of provisions of a CTA that describe the conditions under which an enterprise shall be deemed to have a PE in a contracting jurisdiction in respect of an activity which a person other than an agent of an independent status undertakes for the enterprise. And only to the extent that such provisions address situations in which person has and habitually exercises an authority to conclude contracts. So basically, Para 12.1 shall apply in place of provisions that describe these conditions, which will be only A, which will not be B, which is basically maintaining stock of goods, or C, which is habitually securing orders. So you will have Para 12.1 modifying only 5.4a and not B and C. So India has notified 5.4a correctly, Denmark has notified 5.4. It means nothing. You will still, when you look at the compatibility clause, you will still only modify 5.4a and not impact 5.4b or c of the CT. Right? So though we have data, the OECD matching database saying there is a mismatch, there is no mismatch, only 5.4a gets impacted. But there are one or two more things in this. Why do I even notify? The purpose of notification is to clearly identify the provision which is impacted by the MLI. Otherwise, you will start. Otherwise, a reader will have to go through the entire CTA provision, CTA to identify which provisions are impacted by a particular substantive article of the MLI. So this notification helps in identifying the particular provision, and it provides clarity and transparency to both the parties. Right? So just because there is a 5.4, there's a mismatch in the notification, does not mean the impact is in any way confounded. So you still have only 5.4a getting impacted and not the entire or the B and C also getting modified by Article 12.1 of the MLI. Right? Lastly, there's one more. Yeah, okay, finished. I'll take around 5-7 minutes. We'll finish it off. I hope it is okay. Now, again, we have an example of an incorrect reservation. So what happened in this case is basically on Article 9.2 of the India-Norway CTA. It says the other state basically may make an appropriate adjustment. This is the wordings of the existing CTA. Right? Now, Action 14, one of the best practices, as said, the jurisdiction should include 9.2 of the OECD model and Article 17, which will require the other state mandatorily makes an appropriate adjustment. Shall make an appropriate adjustment is what the OECD model says. Instead of saying may make, it says shall make. Sorry. Okay. Now, Article 17 can be reserved by a contracting jurisdiction only if CTA contains provision similar to the OECD model. Wherever a CJ shall make a corresponding adjustment, a CA shall make a corresponding adjustment. A reservation is possible of Article 17 only if the existing CTA contains this mandatory corresponding adjustment provision in the CTA. Right? Now what happened? We had Norway reserving Article 17 for the reason that it already contains provisions described para 17.2, which is basically mandatory corresponding adjustment. India has not reserved Article 17 because India believes that this is an option, a choice given to a contracting state to make an appropriate adjustment. So may make an appropriate adjustment is an option. So India has not reserved because India wants Article 17.1, which is the corresponding adjustment, to be modified and read into the treaties. So what happens now? We have Norway saying, Norway reserving, India not reserving, but not notifying because there's nothing to notify. No provision is there, which says shall make corresponding adjustment. So in effect, what will happen? Para 1, it is a compatibility clause, shall apply in place of or in absence of a provision that requires a CJ, a contracting jurisdiction, to make an appropriate adjustment. Right? So now you have a situation where Norway has notified, has reserved Article 17, though that reservation is incorrect. Reservation could have been made only if a CTA contains provisions requiring a contracting jurisdiction to make corresponding adjustments mandatorily. So what do you do? So basically, you have a situation where Article 17 would not apply, because if one contracting jurisdiction has reserved, its reservations are always reciprocal. For both the jurisdictions, the particular provision will not apply. But is that the conclusion one can draw? So normally, reservations, as I said, are reciprocal. Article 17 does not apply, 9(2) is not modified. This is the outcome. But can one read Article 9(2) in the existing CTA may make an appropriate adjustment as shall make an appropriate adjustment? Because the reservations given by Norway would be correct only if had it been a mandatory adjustment. So you have a position where a particular provision apparently will not apply, Article 17 of the MLI, but probably one can read that reservation itself is not possible. A reservation given wrongly would be no reservation. And until Norway changes its reservation, one has to read that a particular provision has not been reserved by Norway, and you would have Article 17, para 1 being read into the Article 9(2), and that may becomes shall. Again, as I said, this is a question of interpretation. We do not know how courts will look at it, but these are the problems which we will find scattered across the various CTAs which India has and various positions of the various contracting jurisdictions, the treaty partners, and India. Lastly, one question has been raised. One requirement has been given my invite is basically, do I need a new notification? So this will take 5 minutes with everybody's permission. MLI is notified under 90 subsection 1 on 9th August 19. The notification contains the MLI text as well as India's definitive position. 91 MLI preamble was introduced in 90 subsection 1. The preamble text of the MLI, I should not call it MLI preamble text, I should say preamble text in Article 6 of the MLI was introduced. It is without creating opportunities for non-taxation and or reduced taxation through tax evasion or avoidance. Was added as one of the specified purposes for which the central government can enter into treaties. MLI is a treaty, and it has been notified under 90 subsection 1. But the question remains that amendment which was brought in, the specified purpose of awarding without creating opportunities for non-taxation or reduced taxation through tax evasion or avoidance, was brought into the statute under 90 subsection 1 only with effect from 1/4/21. MLI has been notified much before that, on 9th August 29. This could be one question, that whether do I need to notify MLI again? These are very technical aspects. Obviously, I don't believe it is required, but there is a gap in what has happened. Second point is, and also this my interpretation is also coming out of the memorandum introducing this provision in subsection in section 90 subsection 1, where they say that the specific activity, specific purposes given in 90 subsection 1 were insufficient. These are the words used, was insufficient, which is why these new words have been added. So question is, a notification even before the purpose was brought into the statute, whether it would be valid. So this I'll park in your mind for a future controversy. The more current controversy is this: is a separate notification of the modification to DTAA required? We have this is coming out of the Nestle judgment on the MFN, where the apex court held that the beneficial effect given to a later third-party state has to be notified in the earlier DTAA as a consequential amendment preceded by exchange of communication and acceptance of that position by India. So the Honorable Supreme Court held that there has to be a new notification required for any subsequent modification to give beneficial effect to a treaty because of some other treaty. Now we have MLI is a treaty and we have CTS. Now, because of the CTS, some changes are happening. Because of the MLI, some changes are happening to the CTS. Plus, a new notification required for modification. Now, this was the subject matter of a writ in Delhi High Court. I don't know where it stands today. It is reported in Tax Sutra. Though MLI notified cognizance of anti-fragmentation rule not to be taken since consequences of MLI for DTA not yet been separately notified under section 90 subsection 1. Exactly the same point that you have Nestle now asking for subsequent notification for any changes. Since you are not subsequently notified, there was an India-Switzerland treaty. Since you are not subsequently notified India-Switzerland treaty with the modifications, then anti-fragmentation rule cannot take effect. Or for the matter of PPT cannot take effect. Or any other amendments cannot take effect. But one has to be cautious with this in this interpretation. I would believe that MLA signatories have agreed to its rules. There's an agreement. So when and how the CTA provisions stand modified. So what has happened is you have a notification, presuming that to be a valid notification prior to the specified purposes being brought into the statute under subsection 1 of section 90, presuming it to be valid. It gives you the multilateral instrument text. That's the agreement which India has with the various other signatories. It also gives India's position. Now, based on the India's position and the text, certain outcomes have been agreed to. Based on a position which will be deposited by the counterparty, by a treaty partner, India has accepted the impact of the changes. While in case of your MFN, the argument was India does not agree to the MFN clause, or India agrees to the MFN clause partly. So here, India has agreed to the treaty, the multilateral instrument. That nobody can contradict that. So India has agreed to the multilateral instrument. Question is, is anything further required to maybe notify the positions of the other parties, counterparties, or for the matter of the changes or the modification to the MFN. One other aspect comes into play is an MFN protocol would have modified, would have amended the CTA, TTAA, while in our case, we have both to be read alongside each other. They are not modified. They are not amended, they are only modified. The impact has to be taken into account. So I would believe it's a tough ask. I would not, I had actually raised the issue even before the Nestle judgment came in 2023 in the PCA's paper on MLI. It was an idle mind, something, the argument of the revenue in the MFN case struck me as impractical or maybe not correct. So I'd given a rhetorical question there. Now it has come to pass. Now you find the same thing is a controversy in front of us. But I would believe it is not a correct reading of treaties. Things have been agreed to by India. India has to honor its agreement. So with this, I will thank you for a patient hearing, and any further questions I am ready to take.
I don't believe there are any questions. I think the way you explain things was so perfect that I think most of the doubts are cleared. Sir, I think as a session on overview and interpretation of the MLI was very vital before we dive into the other topics, because without knowing how to interpret a treaty, it's very difficult to understand the articles of that treaty. So thank you so much for doing that perfectly and kind of giving everyone a good background on how to actually read and understand the MLI, not just the specific provision, but the overall context for the same. As Prerna mentioned in her introduction, and you also referenced that this is a topic which is something very close to you and which you're very interested in. And that was, I think, very easily seen with the way you were talking about the provisions and how you took us through it. So thank you so much for taking the time and being here today. And on behalf of the participants and IFA India WRC, we thank you for your contribution and for being here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
So participants, we will start the next session tomorrow morning at 9:30 p.m.
Yes.
Okay. I believe the links will be sent similarly automated link. So see you tomorrow, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you so
Good night.
much.